On the morning of the 31st of August 1997, a 12-year-old boy was woken at Balmoral and told that his mother was dead. The person who told him was not his father. Charles was elsewhere in the castle, being managed by his own people, processing his own version of a night that nobody in that building had been prepared for. The person who told Harry was a woman named Tiggy Legge-Bourke, the woman his mother had despised, had accused, had tried to destroy, had whispered something so vicious too, at a Christmas party 2 years earlier, that Tiggy's lawyers had sent Diana a formal letter demanding a retraction. Tiggy held him. She was the adult who was there, and she held him, and she sat with him through the first hours of the thing that would shape the rest of his life. This is where the story gets complicated. Because Tiggy Legge-Bourke, officially the personal assistant to the Prince of Wales, unofficially, the woman who had become, over 4 years, the closest thing to a maternal presence that William and Harry had on their father's side, was not supposed to be that important. She was hired help. She was background. She was the woman Charles brought in after the separation to take the boys on camping trips and fishing expeditions, and to let them be children in the way that Buckingham Palace could not quite manage, and Kensington Palace, under the weight of Diana's own unhappiness, was finding increasingly difficult. She was not supposed to matter this much. She mattered this much. Diana knew it before anyone else admitted it. Diana had watched Tiggy arrive in 1993 and had understood immediately what she was watching. Not a nanny, not an assistant, but a rival. Someone warm where Diana was volatile. Someone uncomplicated where Diana was consuming. Someone who took the boys fishing and let them get muddy and laughed at things without the laughter carrying the weight of everything else. Someone the boys came home from weekends with looking rested and happy, and not carrying the particular tension that characterized the alternating weeks of a very bad divorce. Diana watched this and it frightened her, and the fear came out the way Diana's fear always came out, as a weapon turned on the person she feared. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What she said to Tiggy at that Christmas party in 1995 was not made public at the time and has been disputed since. What is not disputed is that Tiggy's solicitors sent Diana a letter. What is not disputed is that Diana eventually apologized. What is not disputed is that the apology changed nothing, that Tiggy's position in the household and the position in the boys' lives that the household represented remained exactly what it had been. Diana died in Paris in the early hours of August 31st, 1997. By mid-morning, Tiggy was holding a 12-year-old in a castle in Scotland, and then, over the years that followed, in the gradual way of things that the palace prefers not to announce, Tiggy Legge-Bourke was moved to the edges of the picture. William grew up, Harry grew up, Charles remarried. The role that Tiggy had filled with a warmth and a competence that everyone who watched it acknowledged, the role that nobody had formally defined and nobody had put in writing, became unnecessary, and then became absent, and Tiggy receded. She married in 1999. She moved to Wales. She had children of her own. She remained, in Harry's account of his own life, one of the people he loved. She remained, in the public record, a footnote, a warm one, but a footnote. What she had been, for 4 years in the middle of the worst period of 2 boys' childhood, was something considerably larger than a footnote. This is that story. Her real name was Alexandra. Nobody called her Alexandra. She had been Tiggy since childhood, which tells you something useful about her before you know anything else. That she was, from an early age, the kind of person whose nickname stuck so completely that the official version became ceremonial, something that appeared on documents and disappeared from conversation. Tiggy. From Mrs. Tiggywinkle, the Beatrix Potter hedgehog who takes in other people's washing and sorts out their problems and gets on with things without requiring thanks. The nickname was affectionate and accurate, and it followed her into the most consequential years of her life. She was born in 1964 into a family that belonged, in the specific social geography of Britain, to what is sometimes called the Welsh gentry, a category that is aristocratic in character and not always in title, landed without always being wealthy, connected to the kind of world where the royal family was known personally rather than theoretically. The family home was Glanwsk Park in Breconshire, a large estate in the Usk Valley, The kind of place where children grew up understanding that the outside world was something you moved through rather than something you looked at. Mountains, river, the specific outdoor texture of the Welsh borders, which is different from the English countryside, and different again from the Scottish Highlands, wilder in a more intimate way, less managed. Tiggy grew up in it. She grew up fishing in the Usk, walking in the Brecon beacons, riding in the way that children raised on estates ride, not as a hobby, not as a scheduled activity, but as a form of movement through the land they lived on. She grew up comfortable with mud and weather and dogs and the ordinary mess of country life. She grew up, in other words, in precisely the environment that would make her, 3 decades later, exactly what 2 young princes needed. Her mother, Tiggy Legge-Bourke, was a lady-in-waiting to Princess Anne. This connection to the royal family was not incidental. It meant that the palace was not an abstract concept for Tiggy growing up. It was a world she had some proximity to, through her mother's professional life, through the social overlap between the Welsh gentry and the royal circle that used the same country estates and the same country pursuits and moved through the same calendar of events. She did not grow up inside the palace world. She grew up adjacent to it, which is different and in some ways more useful. She understood it without being formed entirely by it. She was educated at the Institut Alpin Wiedemannet in Switzerland, one of the finishing schools that the daughters of a certain class of British family attended in the 1980s, institutions designed to produce young women who were confident in social situations, fluent in French, and capable of organizing themselves in any environment that required both. Tiggy emerged from it with the social ease the institution was designed to produce, and also, apparently, with enough of her own character intact, that the social ease never curdled into the particular kind of brittle confidence that finishing schools sometimes manufactured instead. Then she did something that distinguished her from most of her contemporaries with similar backgrounds. She trained at the Montessori Institute in London. The Montessori method, like the Froebel method before it, was premised on the conviction that children learned best through genuine engagement with their environment, rather than through instruction delivered at them, and that the role of the adult was to provide conditions rather than control outcomes. The training was serious. Tiggy took it seriously. This was not decorative credential gathering. She came out of the Montessori training with a genuine philosophy about children, about what they needed and how they learned, and what happened to them when the adults around them understood those things, and what happened when those adults didn't. She opened a nursery school. It was called, with the self-aware humor of someone who knew exactly what her nickname was doing, Mrs. Tiggywinkles. It was in London, in the early 1990s, and it was a working nursery school in the full sense, not a playgroup for aristocratic children, not a social arrangement, but an actual educational enterprise that Tiggy ran with the practical intelligence and the genuine warmth that characterized everything she put her name to. She was good at it. Parents liked her. Children responded to her in the way that children respond to adults who take them seriously, without performing the taking seriously, who are actually interested in what's in front of them, rather than in how the interest looks. This was who Tiggy Legge-Bourke was in 1993, when the call came from the Prince of Wales's office. The call came because Charles needed something specific and didn't quite know how to describe it. He and Diana had separated in December 1992. The separation had been announced in Parliament by the Prime Minister, in language that was precise and dignified, and barely contained the chaos behind it. The marriage had been collapsing for years, in ways that had generated enormous press coverage and enormous public argument, and an enormous amount of damage to the 2 people most directly involved, with the damage spilling outward and downward onto the 2 children who had not chosen any of it, and who were now, at 10 and 8 years old, being managed between 2 households that were in barely suppressed conflict with each other. William was 10, Harry was 8. They were at Eton and Ludgrove respectively, which meant they were in schools designed for children of their background and class, and which were, in their way, reasonably good at producing a certain kind of resilience, the resilience of institutional life, of dormitories and fixed schedules, and the managed distance from home that boarding school imposes. The resilience they were building was real, and was also insufficient for what their home life was containing. Charles needed someone for the boys on his time with them. Not a nanny in the traditional sense. William was too old for that, and the word itself carried the wrong connotation, something too formal and too below stairs for what he was envisioning. He needed someone warm, someone outdoor-oriented, someone who could take the boys fishing without it being an organized expedition, who could let them be muddy and loud in the way that boys need to be muddy and loud, who could exist in the space between parental figure and trusted adult friend without making the territory uncomfortable. He needed, in other words, someone like Tiggy. The connection came through her mother. Tiggy Legge-Bourke's proximity to the palace made the introduction a natural one. The interview, by the accounts available, was less like a formal royal household appointment process and more like a conversation between people who were establishing whether they liked each other. Tiggy was not performing for the job. She was not adjusting her manner to suit what she thought Charles was looking for. She was herself, direct, warm, practically organized, clear about what she was good at and what she wasn't. Charles offered her the position of personal assistant. The title was, as titles in the royal household frequently are, a partial description of an actual role that was considerably more complicated than its official name suggested. Personal assistant did not convey what Tiggy would actually be doing, which was taking William and Harry on the kind of expeditions and into the kind of environments that would allow them to be children rather than symbols. In the hours and days and weekends when their father had them and needed someone reliable and warm and capable of managing two young people without making the management visible, she accepted. She began in the autumn of 1993, which was the autumn that the full scale of what was happening to the Waleses' marriage became public property in a new way. The serialization of Andrew Morton's biography of Diana had already run the previous year. The Camillagate tape, a recording of a private telephone conversation between Charles and Camilla Parker Bowles, was published in January 1993, with a specificity of intimate detail that made the newspaper coverage of it extraordinary, even by the standards of what the coverage of this marriage had already produced. The country was watching the dissolution of the fairy tale in real time, in considerable and unflattering detail, and at the center of it, trying to have something resembling a childhood, were two boys who had not caused any of it. Tiggy's job, on the days she had them, was to give those boys something normal, something that did not vibrate with the tension of what was happening around them, something that required their hands and their bodies and their attention, rather than their capacity to manage the emotional weight of being the children of Charles and Diana. She took them to Balmoral and let them fish. She took them to Wales, to Glanysque, the landscape she had grown up in, where the weather was reliable and the river was cold and there was nothing to do that wasn't good for you. She took them shooting, climbing, walking. She organized weekends at Highgrove that were, in the accounts that emerged later from people who were there, genuinely warm, loud and untidy, and full of the kind of laughter that happens when adults are not performing warmth but actually experiencing it. William and Harry responded to her with an immediacy that told you something essential about what they had been missing. Not love, they had love. Complicated and difficult love, from both parents, in the specific turbulent forms that both parents expressed it. What they had been missing was ease. The simple ease of being around an adult who did not need anything from them, who was not managing them toward any particular outcome, who found them funny and let them know it, who got muddy alongside them and did not treat the muddiness as something to be managed. Tiggy was easy, in the specific and valuable sense of someone whose presence does not add to the weight of a situation but relieves it. She was the adult in their lives who made things lighter, and for boys in the situation William and Harry were in, lighter was not a small thing. It was the thing that made the rest of the weight survivable. Diana watched all of this from Kensington Palace and understood, with the precise emotional intelligence that had always been both her greatest quality and the source of her greatest suffering, exactly what was happening. She was watching her sons come back from weekends with their father, looking better than they had looked going. She was watching them talk about Tiggy with the uncomplicated warmth of children, describing someone they like without complication. She was watching a woman become important in the lives of the two people she loved most. Diana's response to things she feared was rarely measured. It was usually, in the end, some combination of accurate perception and disproportionate reaction, the two things arriving together in a way that made the accuracy hard to defend and the reaction hard to dismiss. She saw what was happening and she was right about what she saw, and the way she responded to what she saw made the response itself the story rather than the thing it was responding to. She saw a rival. She was not, by any honest accounting, wrong. What she may have miscalculated was what the rivalry actually was. It was not, the evidence suggests, romantic. The specific accusation Diana made, the one delivered at the Christmas party in 1995, the one that required solicitors to be involved, was denied by Tiggy and by the palace, and, in all the years of subsequent inquiry into everything that happened in this period, was never substantiated. What the rivalry was maternal, or something adjacent to maternal, a competition for a specific kind of presence in the boys' lives, a kind that Diana could not always provide, because her own situation was consuming what she had to give, and that Tiggy provided naturally, because it was simply who she was. This distinction would not have comforted Diana. It may have been more threatening than the alternative. What Tiggy was building with William and Harry, through the fishing trips and the muddy weekends and the laughter at Highgrove, was something that did not compete with what Diana gave them. It occupied a different space entirely. Diana was their mother, and the intensity of that was absolute. Tiggy was the person on their father's side who made their time, on their father's side, feel like time, rather than survival. Both things were necessary. Only one of them was uncomplicated. That was the point. The particular genius of what Tiggy provided was that it did not look like genius. It looked like a woman taking two boys fishing. This is the thing about genuinely good work with children. It conceals itself. The children experience it as fun, as freedom, as the uncomplicated pleasure of being somewhere doing something with someone who is glad to be there with them. The adult doing the work experiences it as exactly that too, which is why it works. Tiggy was not calculating the therapeutic value of the Usk Valley. She was taking boys she liked to a river she loved, and letting what happened happen. That what happened was good for them was a consequence of her being genuinely herself, rather than performing a version of herself the role required. This is harder than it sounds. The royal household had a long and documented history of producing, around the children within it, adults who were performing warmth rather than expressing it, who understood, either instinctively or through professional training, that proximity to royalty required a certain management of self that made the self secondary to the role. The nursemaids and nannies and equerries who populated the institutional childhoods of the Windsors across the generations were often good people and sometimes exceptional ones, but they were operating within a structure that made the structure visible, that made you aware, always, of the specific hierarchy of the world you were in. Tiggy made you forget the hierarchy. This was not because she was disrespectful of it or didn't understand it. She understood it precisely. She had grown up adjacent to this world, knew how it worked, knew what it required. She simply had the quality, which not everyone has, of being so entirely herself, within whatever context she occupied, that the context became secondary. When she was at the river with William and Harry, the river was the context, not the fact that they were the Prince of Wales's sons, not the institutional weight of the household they came from, not the ongoing explosion of their parents' marriage. The river, the fish, the cold and the mud, and the serious technical question of whether you were casting correctly. William was 13 in the first year of Tiggy's appointment, 14 by the end of it. The age matters, because 13 and 14 are years in which a boy is in the process of becoming someone, and the process is not always comfortable. He was also, in 1993 and 1994, a boy whose parents' marriage was collapsing in front of the entire world, whose mother's unhappiness was enormous and visible, whose father's private life had been recorded on tape and published in the national press with specificity that adults found uncomfortable, and that a 13-year-old was processing in ways nobody could fully see. William in these years was, by the accounts of people who knew him, controlled in the way of someone who has decided that control is the appropriate response to a situation that cannot be controlled. He was watchful, he was careful. He had the quality of someone who has concluded, somewhere around the age of 10 or 11, that the adults around him required management, and that he was available to provide it. He managed his mother's moods. He managed the space between his parents on the occasions when they occupied it simultaneously. He managed his own visible feelings with a thoroughness that people found admirable, and that was also, For a boy in early adolescence, an enormous amount of work. With Tiggy, he did not manage. This is the thing that everyone who observed them together noted, in different words, but with consistent meaning. He relaxed. Not dramatically, not in the performed way of someone who has been told that they are allowed to relax, in the organic way of someone who has encountered an environment in which relaxing is simply the appropriate response. Tiggy did not need managing. She was not unhappy or volatile or carrying the weight of something enormous. She was a 30-year-old woman at a river with a boy she liked, and her not needing managing freed him from the habit of it. Harry was different by nature and was responding to the same situation differently. He was younger, 8 when the separation was announced, 9 when Tiggy arrived, which meant the period he was old enough to remember was the period of the collapse, rather than what had come before. He had not known the marriage as anything other than the difficult thing it had become by the time he was old enough to form coherent memories of it. The difficulty was his baseline. This is a particular kind of childhood, and it produces a particular kind of person, someone for whom the intensity of the environment is normal, whose nervous system is calibrated to a higher level of ambient tension than most people ever experience. Tiggy, with Harry, was the same thing she was with William, easier than what he was used to, but the effect registered differently because the baseline was different. With William, she was a relief. With Harry, she was, the accounts suggest, something closer to a revelation. He had not known it could be like this. He had not known that adults could simply be there, without anything underneath the being there. He responded to her with the specific and sometimes overwhelming affection of someone who has found something they did not know was missing. He called her his second mum. He said this openly, to people, with the directness that characterized Harry from childhood, the willingness to say the thing that the situation contained, without first calculating whether the saying of it was appropriate. He loved Tiggy in the way of someone who has no complicated feelings about the love, and this uncomplicated love was something he would carry for decades, and would describe, in his own account of his life, as one of the things that had sustained him through years that required sustaining. Diana knew he called her this. Diana knew everything that happened in her sons' lives with a thoroughness that was the product of genuine maternal attention and also of something more anxious than attention, of a mother who understood that the world her sons moved in on their father's side was a world she did not control and could not fully see, and who therefore gathered information about it with the intensity of someone who has learned that information is the only available substitute for presence. The information she gathered about Tiggy was accurate, and the conclusions she drew from it were largely correct, and her response to those conclusions was, in the way of Diana's responses generally, conducted at a volume that made the accuracy and the correctness difficult to defend. She raised Tiggy's salary at one point, a strange move that seems to make no sense until you understand the logic behind it. If Tiggy was paid more, she was more clearly an employee, more clearly in a category that could be defined, and therefore managed, less ambiguous in her position relative to the boys. The palace resisted this. The palace's resistance confirmed, for Diana, that Tiggy's ambiguity was intentional and therefore threatening. She made comments. She made them to the press, through the oblique channels that Diana had become expert at using. Not direct quotes, but unmistakable implications. Not named sources, but obvious proximities. The press understood who was talking, and printed what the implications contained. Tiggy, reading the coverage, understood it perfectly. In November 1995, Diana gave the Panorama interview. Martin Bashir, a BBC journalist, sat with Diana in a room at Kensington Palace and asked her questions that she answered with a candor that was, by the standards of what senior members of the royal family had previously permitted themselves to say on television, extraordinary. She talked about her marriage. She talked about Charles. She talked about Camilla Parker Bowles. She said she did not think Charles was suited for kingship. She said she wanted to be a Queen of Hearts. She cried. She looked into the camera with the direct, wide-eyed gaze that she had learned produced a specific response in anyone watching, and she produced that response. Roughly 15 million people watched it in Britain alone. The palace watched it with the controlled fury of an institution that had just been addressed directly, on primetime television, by one of its own, and that had no immediate mechanism for responding to the directness. Tiggy was not the subject of the Panorama interview. Diana's feelings about Tiggy were not articulated on camera in November 1995. What the interview did, in the context of Tiggy's story, was establish the temperature of Diana's situation, the level of anger and desperation and tactical aggression that was operating in those months. The Panorama interview was Diana choosing the nuclear option in the ongoing war with the palace, and choosing it with the full understanding of what she was doing. A month after the interview, the nuclear option was still warm, and Diana walked into a Christmas party. The party was a charitable event, the kind of occasion the royal family and its adjacent social world attended regularly, a gathering of people connected to good causes and connected to each other, the specific texture of upper-class London charity life in December. Tiggy was there, Diana was there. The room contained, therefore, both women in the same space, for one of the relatively rare occasions when this occurred. What Diana said to Tiggy at that party has never been definitively established in public record. The allegation that Diana delivered, the accounts suggest, at close range and without apparent premeditation, was specific and serious, and concerned Tiggy's private life in a way that, if true, would have been genuinely damaging, and, if false, constituted a significant act of aggression against someone who had done nothing to deserve it. The allegation was false. Tiggy's solicitors wrote to Diana in January 1996, on her behalf, demanding a retraction and an apology. The letter did not specify the allegation in writing. Solicitors' letters in situations like this one are careful about what they commit to the page. What the letter specified was the requirement for Diana to acknowledge that what she had said was untrue and to apologize for having said it. Diana eventually apologized. The apology came in the manner of apologies given by people who are sorry they have been required to apologize, rather than sorry for the thing the apology addresses. It arrived through lawyers. It did not, by any account, involve Diana contacting Tiggy directly. It resolved the legal situation without resolving anything else. Tiggy, through all of this, maintained a public silence that was, by the standards of what the principal characters in the Wales drama were saying publicly in 1996, remarkable. She did not speak to the press. She did not give interviews. She did not, through any of the oblique channels available, let it be known what she thought about being the subject of a false allegation delivered at a Christmas party by the Princess of Wales. She continued her work. She continued showing up for the boys on their father's time. She continued being the person she was, with a steadiness that the situation around her was doing everything possible to make difficult. The steadiness was genuine. This is worth saying clearly, because the circumstances around it were not steady. The Wales marriage, which had been the great public drama of the preceding years, was now being wound up formally. The Queen wrote to both Charles and Diana in December 1995, urging divorce. The divorce was agreed in the spring of 1996 and finalized in August of that year, with terms that included Diana's loss of the title Her Royal Highness. Diana, post-divorce, was the Princess of Wales, without being a Royal Highness, which meant she was simultaneously one of the most famous women in the world and someone the institution had formally reduced. She was outside the walls. Not entirely, she remained the mother of the heirs, which gave her an irreducible connection, but outside in a new way, a formal way, a way that the institution had made legible. She was also, post-divorce, someone with considerably more freedom than she had had inside the marriage, and she used it in ways that generated continued press coverage and continued public argument. The relationship with Dodi Fayed began in the summer of 1997. The press followed them across the Mediterranean with the enthusiasm reserved for stories that combined the royal family with wealth and romance and conflict, which is to say with nearly unlimited enthusiasm. Tiggy continued to show up. She continued to take the boys fishing. She continued to let Harry call her what he called her, and William be what he was with her. She was, through the increasingly chaotic final year of Diana's life, the stable point on Charles's side of the equation, and she was it, without apparent effort, which is what being a stable point looks like when you are actually one rather than performing one. Then August arrived, then Paris, then the morning of the 31st, and the knock on the door in Balmoral, and the 12-year-old boy who needed someone, and Tiggy was there. What followed that morning, what Tiggy said and did in the hours after Harry was told, in the days that followed, in the weeks at Balmoral where the family was sequestered, while the country's grief ran at a temperature nobody had anticipated. This is not fully in the public record, and Tiggy has not made it public. What Harry said, in his own account of the period, was that she was there, that she held him, that in the worst morning of his life, the person who showed up was Tiggy. She had been showing up for 4 years. This particular showing up was the one that history would record. It was also, though nobody said this at the time, the beginning of the end of the period in which showing up was the role she occupied. The boys were about to become different things. The world around them was about to reorganize itself. The space that Tiggy had filled, warm, easy, outdoor, uncomplicated, was going to become, as William and Harry grew older and the institutional requirements of their lives became more demanding, a space the institution would gradually close. She did not know this on the morning of August 31st, 1997. She was holding a 12-year-old boy who had just lost his mother, and that was the only thing that was true that morning, and it was enough to require everything she had. She gave everything she had. It was not the last time she would be required to, but it was the most important time, and she was ready for it in the way that she had always been ready for whatever the situation needed. Not because she had planned for it, not because she had been trained for this specific morning, but because being ready was simply who she was. The days between the 31st of August and the 6th of September, 1997, were unlike anything Britain had experienced in living memory, and unlike anything the royal family had experienced in the whole of the modern era. The grief was real. This is worth stating clearly, because there has been, in the decades since, a revisionist tendency to describe the public mourning for Diana as manufactured, as hysteria, as a collective emotional performance that said more about the crowd than about the person being mourned. The revisionism is wrong. The grief was genuine, and it was enormous, and it arrived with a force and a speed that nobody, not the palace, not the press, not the government, not the people feeling it, had anticipated or prepared for. Within hours of the announcement, flowers began appearing outside Kensington Palace. Within days, the pile had grown to a depth and a breadth that the palace groundskeepers had no precedent for managing. People came from across the country to place flowers and stand in silence and weep in public in a way that the English, specifically, were not supposed to do. They did it anyway. The grief moved through the country like weather, arriving without warning, uncontrollable once it arrived, leaving everything it touched in a different condition from the one it had found. The royal family was at Balmoral. They stayed at Balmoral. This was, in retrospect, the decision that came closest to causing the institution serious and lasting damage in the week after Diana's death. The country was in the streets, outside Kensington Palace, outside Buckingham Palace, outside every royal building it could reach, expressing something enormous, and the royal family was in the Scottish Highlands, maintaining the routines of a private family holiday, with a discipline that read, to the people in the streets, as indifference. It was not indifference. The decision to stay had a logic behind it, and the logic was the children. William was 15, and Harry was 12, and they had just lost their mother, and the instinct of the people around them, Charles, the Queen, Philip, and Tiggy, was to give them the one thing the situation contained that could be given: privacy. Time. The absence of cameras. The specific shelter of Balmoral, which was remote and gated, and surrounded by landscape that the cameras could not penetrate, in which 2 boys could grieve without the grief being recorded and broadcast and turned into content. The instinct was correct for the boys. It was wrong for the country. The country needed something from the institution, in those days, that the institution did not understand it needed. It needed to see the institution grieve. It needed the royal family to be present in the public grief, to participate in it, rather than shelter from it, to acknowledge, through their visibility, that the loss was real, and that they felt it. The country did not need the details of what the boys were experiencing in the corridors of Balmoral. It needed the flag over Buckingham Palace to fly at half-mast. The flag flew at full mast. The palace did not, by convention and constitutional logic, fly the flag at half-mast when the sovereign was alive. The flag was the sovereign's flag, not the nation's, and its position reflected the sovereign's presence rather than the national mood. The convention was defensible. It was also, in the specific circumstances of that week, a disaster. The public mood darkened. The press, which had been printing tributes since the announcement, shifted. Questions appeared in print that had not appeared before, about the royal family's response, about the palace's management of the situation, about whether the institution was capable of feeling what it was being asked to feel. The questions had an edge to them that suggested the affection the country had maintained for the monarchy was not unconditional, had never been unconditional, and that the condition it was attached to was something like, "You must be present when we need you to be present." The Queen returned to London. She addressed the nation. The flag was lowered. The crisis, which had briefly felt existential, subsided. Inside Balmoral, through all of this, Tiggy was with the boys. What she was managing during those days at Balmoral is not fully in the public record, because Tiggy has not put it there, and the people who were present have been careful about what they have said, and the boys themselves have given only partial accounts of the internal experience of those days. What can be assembled from the available material is a picture of someone doing something very difficult with very few resources, managing two young people in acute grief in an environment that was itself managing an institutional crisis, with no map for any of it and no one to model the right approach on, because there was no right approach available to model. She did what she had always done. She was there. She was steady. She was the person who sat with them when sitting was what was needed, and moved with them when moving was what was needed, and was quiet when quiet was right, and present when present was all there was to offer. Harry has described this period in the terms available to someone who experienced it at 12, in the flashes and the specific details that memory preserves from trauma, rather than in the sequential narrative that distance sometimes constructs. What he has described, consistently, across the years in which he has been willing to discuss it, is Tiggy's presence as one of the things that made the days survivable. Not the main thing, not a replacement for what had been lost, but a real thing, a present thing, something that was actually there in the corridor or in the room when the alternative was nothing. William processed the same experience differently, as he processed most things differently. His account of those days, to the extent that any account has emerged, is considerably more private than Harry's. What the people who were there have said about William in the days after Diana's death is that he was controlled in a way that concerned the adults around him, that he was managing himself, again, in the way he had been managing himself for years, holding what he was feeling, with a discipline that was admirable, and also, for a 15-year-old who had just lost his mother, something to worry about. Tiggy worried about it. She did not push. Pushing was not the Tiggy method, had never been the Tiggy method with William specifically, because William required a different approach than Harry, and she had understood this since 1993. She was available. She stayed available. She trusted that availability was its own form of help, and that William would use it when he was ready to use it. The funeral was the 6th of September. William and Harry walked behind their mother's coffin through the streets of London, in a procession that covered the distance from Kensington Palace to Westminster Abbey, and they walked it in public, in front of hundreds of thousands of people who lined the route, and millions more who watched on television, and they walked it with the composure of people who had decided that composure was the only available form of dignity. They were 15 and 12 years old. Tiggy walked near them, not beside them in the formal position. The formal positions in the procession were occupied by the men, Charles, Philip, Earl Spencer, and the two boys. But near them, close enough to be available, in the position of someone whose function in the procession was support rather than protocol. She had no official title that explained her presence in the procession. She was there because she was Tiggy, because she was the person who had been there on the morning of the 31st, because William and Harry needed someone in that procession who was specifically theirs rather than the institution's, and she was the person who filled that need. The footage of the procession, watched again now with the knowledge of everything that followed, shows two boys doing something no child should be required to do. The country watching them do it felt something that was part grief for Diana and part something else, something uncomfortable, something that had to do with what was being asked of them and whether it was right to ask it. Earl Spencer, Diana's brother, gave his eulogy in the Abbey and directed a portion of it at the institution, at the palace, at the world that had surrounded and constrained and damaged his sister, and the congregation applauded in a way that congregations in Westminster Abbey do not applaud, and the applause moved from inside the Abbey to the crowds outside, passing through the ancient stone walls as though the walls were not there. William and Harry sat in the front row and heard all of it. Tiggy sat close enough to be there. The days after the funeral were the beginning of the transition. Not dramatic, not announced, but real. The institutional response to Diana's death included, over the following months and years, a gradual reorganization of the boys' lives that reflected both their ages and the changed situation. William was approaching Eton's sixth form. Harry was at Ludgrove, moving toward Eton himself. The structures around both of them were the structures of boarding school, of institutional life, of the specific social world that their education was placing them in. Tiggy's role shifted as the boys shifted. She was still there, still the person on their father's side who could be called, who would show up, who provided the specific continuity of someone who had known them since William was 10 and Harry was 8. But the daily operational role, the fishing trips, the muddy weekends, the being the person who is there, this role was evolving in the way that roles evolve when the children in them are growing up and requiring different things from the adults around them. Charles, in the years after Diana's death, was also reorganizing. The relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles, which had been the private fact of the preceding years and the public scandal of 1993, was moving toward a different stage, toward the possibility of formalization, of acknowledgement, of the slow process by which Camilla would eventually become acceptable to the public that had received the Camillagate tape with such revulsion. This process required management and time, and the particular patience of someone who understood that public opinion moved at its own pace, regardless of institutional preference. Tiggy was not part of this reorganization. She was not in competition with it. Camilla and Tiggy occupied entirely different functions in Charles's world, and there was no structural conflict between them. But the reorganization changed the shape of the household Tiggy had been operating within, and as the shape changed, her position within it shifted accordingly. She married in 1999. The man she married was Charles Pettifer, a former army officer. The wedding was in Wales, at the church near Glanysque, surrounded by the landscape she had grown up in and returned to in the years of her appointment with the boys. It was, by the accounts available, the kind of wedding that reflects the person who organized it. Warm, well-attended, not lavish, genuinely celebratory rather than performatively so. Both William and Harry attended. They were 16 and 14. They came to Wales and sat in the church and watched Tiggy marry someone who was evidently good for her, and the attendance was, the accounts suggest, easy, not a duty, not a managed obligation, but the simple presence of young people at a celebration for someone they loved. She moved to Wales after the wedding. This was not a departure from the boys in the dramatic sense. She did not vanish from their lives, did not cease to be the person they could call, did not become a figure from the past rather than a presence in the present, but it was a geographical reality that changed the texture of availability. She was in the Brecon Beacons with a husband and, eventually, with children of her own. She was building the private life that the appointment had deferred. She was becoming, at last, the thing she had always also been alongside the role, a person with her own life, her own family, her own center of gravity. The boys were growing up. William was moving through Eton and toward a gap year and toward St Andrews, where he would study and meet Catherine Middleton and begin the next stage of the life the institution had laid out for him. Harry was at Eton, finding it harder than William had, finding most things harder than William had, in the way of someone whose nervous system was calibrated differently and whose situation had never quite been equivalent despite the apparent similarity. They carried Tiggy with them, not physically, not in the daily operational sense, but in the way that the important early relationships are carried, as a reference point, as a proof of something, as the evidence that a specific kind of ease had been possible at a specific time, and that its having been possible was not something that could be taken back. Harry would call her. He continued to call her through the Eton years and through Sandhurst, and through the deployments to Afghanistan, and through the years of difficulty that followed, the years he would eventually write about. She was the person he called. She was the person who picked up. William's relationship with her was less documented in public, but by all indications equally genuine, a quieter version of the same attachment, expressed through the reserved channel that William expressed most things through, but real. The palace did not celebrate Tiggy's role. This is not unusual. The palace does not celebrate the roles of individuals within its operation unless the celebration serves an institutional purpose, and Tiggy's role served an entirely personal purpose, which is different. She had been there for two boys during the worst years of their childhood, and she had done it well, and the institution had no mechanism for acknowledging this, so it didn't. She received no formal acknowledgement of what she had given, no title, no honor, no public recognition from the institution that had benefited from her presence in the lives of its heirs. She received the private acknowledgement of the two people whose lives she had most directly affected, which was real and was sufficient for her, and which tells you, without anything further being needed, what kind of person she was. She was not doing it for the acknowledgement. She had never been doing it for the acknowledgement. She had been doing it because two boys needed someone, and she was the someone available and capable and willing, and the doing of it had been its own completeness, and the acknowledgement, or its absence, was not the thing that determined whether it had mattered. It had mattered. The boys knew it. They had always known it. They were, by the early 2000s, young men moving through the formal structures of royal life with varying degrees of ease and difficulty, and somewhere in the foundation of both of them, quietly and without announcement, was the thing that Tiggy had built through 4 years of fishing trips and muddy weekends and the specific gift of showing up. You cannot take back something that has already been given. The palace could not reach what Tiggy had put in those boys between 1993 and 1997. It had been given before the giving could be managed, or measured, or contained, and it was in them now, permanent, the evidence of what genuine warmth looks like when it is offered without conditions. She had offered it without conditions. They had received it in the same spirit. And the institution, which had required both of them without formally acknowledging either the requirement or the person who had met it, moved forward in the way that institutions move, without looking back, without accounting, without the kind of retrospective examination that would require it to ask what it had taken and what it had given in return. Tiggy went to Wales. The boys grew up. The story continued in the way that real stories continue, not toward a conclusion, but toward the next thing, and then the thing after that, carrying everything that had happened in the foundation of everything that followed. William and Harry diverged after Diana died, in the way that siblings diverge when the same event lands differently on two different nervous systems. This is not a complicated observation, but it is an important one, because the divergence explains a great deal about what followed, about who each of them became in the decade after August 1997, and about what the institution around them was and wasn't capable of providing, and about why Tiggy's voice on the end of a phone remained, for one of them specifically, one of the more reliable things in a world that was not reliably kind to him. William's path, after the funeral, and after Eton's sixth form, and after the gap year that took him to Chile and Belize, and the Raleigh International Program, led to St. Andrews. He went to Scotland in the autumn of 2001 to read history of art at a university that was old and serious and sufficiently removed from London to provide something approaching a normal student life. He was 19. He lived in a hall of residence with other students. He went to lectures. He had friends who were not royal and who were required, by the specific agreement the press had made with the palace regarding William's university years, to remain unphotographed and undisturbed. He also, in his first year at St. Andrews, met Catherine Middleton. She was in the same hall. She was studying history of art. She was, by every account of people who knew her then, exactly the kind of person whose qualities are not immediately obvious because they are not performed. Someone whose composure and warmth and fundamental decency revealed themselves gradually rather than announcing themselves immediately. William noticed gradually and then, by the accounts of people close to him, did not stop noticing. What Catherine Middleton provided William with, over the following years, through the on-off trajectory of the relationship, through the graduation and the military training and the public appearances and the waiting that Catherine's position required a very particular kind of patience to sustain, was something adjacent to what Tiggy had provided in the childhood years. Ease, the quality of someone whose presence did not add to the institutional weight, but relieved it. Someone warm and steady, who was there because she chose to be, rather than because the institution required it. William had known this quality before. Tiggy had given it to him. The fact that he recognized it in Catherine, and that he pursued the recognition with the quiet determination that was his characteristic mode, suggests something about what the earlier experience had taught him, that this specific quality existed and was worth pursuing. Harry's path from the same starting point went somewhere else entirely. He stayed at Eton after the funeral, as William had, and Eton did for him what Eton does for a specific kind of boy. It provided structure and tradition and the specific social education of an institution that has been producing a certain kind of English man for centuries. What it did not provide, and what Harry needed more than the other kind, was any particular framework for processing what had happened to him. Eton was good at producing stoic young men. Harry was not, by nature or by the specific character of his experience, someone for whom stoicism was a natural fit. He was also, in the years immediately after his mother's death, someone whose grief had not been processed in any systematic way. This is documented, Harry has said so himself, in the terms available to someone who has thought about it carefully over many years. He had been 12 on the morning of August 31, 1997. He had walked behind the coffin 6 days later. He had then returned to school, returned to the structure of institutional life, returned to the forward motion that institutional life requires, and that, in its requiring of forward motion, does not leave much room for the opposite. The grief went underground. This is what grief does when there is no permission for it to move any other direction. It does not disappear. It relocates, becomes something else, surfaces in forms that are not immediately recognizable as grief, in restlessness, in self-destruction, in the specific quality of someone who is looking for something they cannot name because the thing they are actually looking for is not available. Harry was 16 when the story broke in The Sun. The year was 2002. The story was that he had smoked cannabis at a party near Highgrove and had been seen doing so by enough people that the story was solid, and The Sun had it and ran it. The coverage was enormous, not because cannabis use among 16-year-olds was genuinely surprising, but because this 16-year-old was the son of the heir to the throne, and because the specific combination of the royal family and adolescent transgression was the kind of story the British tabloid press existed to produce. Charles's response was to send Harry to a drugs rehabilitation center for a day visit, not because Harry was an addict, not because the situation was clinically serious, but as a visible demonstration of appropriate parental response to the coverage. The visit was arranged and the press was told it had happened, and the story moved on, in the way that stories move on when they have been given a resolution to report. What the visit did not do was address anything underneath the surface. The surface had been managed. The underneath was still there. Tiggy, during these years, was in Wales. She had her own children now. Her son Charlie was born in 2000, her daughter Tiggy in 2002. She was building the private life at Glenusk that the appointment with the princes had deferred. She was not a daily presence in Harry's life, in any operational sense. She was a voice on the phone. Harry called her. This is documented in his own account, in the terms that Harry uses when he talks about the people who mattered to him, directly, without the institutional hedging that royal communication usually employs, with the unguarded specificity of someone who has decided that the experience of the thing is more important than the management of how the experience is received. He called Tiggy when things were difficult. She picked up. What passed between them in those calls has not been made public in detail, and that it has not been made public is itself consistent with who Tiggy is, someone who does not put things in the public record that belong in the private one. What Harry has said, in general terms, is that she was there, that the being there, even across a phone line, across the distance between wherever he was and wherever she was, in the Brecon Beacons, mattered, that it was one of the reliable things in a period that was not reliably kind to him. The period was not reliably kind to him. In January 2005, at a fancy dress party before the start of his final Eton term, Harry wore a Nazi uniform. The costume included a swastika armband. A photograph was taken. The photograph appeared in The Sun the following week, with a front page that made its opinion of the costume clear. The coverage was global, immediate, and unsparing, and it came with the specific quality of coverage that confirms a narrative the press has been building, the narrative of Harry as the wild one, the difficult one, the one whose grip on the requirements of his position was less secure than his brother's. The palace issued an apology on Harry's behalf. Harry apologized. The story ran its course. The management of the aftermath was handled with the institutional efficiency of a household that had been managing royal missteps for centuries and had refined the process considerably. What was not managed, because the institution did not have a mechanism for managing it, was why a 20-year-old prince in line to the throne had arrived at a fancy dress party in a Nazi uniform in the first place. What combination of poor judgment and absent guidance, and the specific aimlessness of someone who has not yet found a purpose, had produced that specific decision on that specific evening? Harry has talked about this in his later account, in the terms of someone who has done considerable retrospective work on the person he was then. He was not a calculating person. He was not making a political statement. He was a young man whose judgment was not always reliable, whose grief had been underground for 8 years by this point, whose relationship with authority was complicated by the specific authority he had grown up within, and who had not yet found the thing that would give the restlessness somewhere to go. That thing was the army. He went to Sandhurst in May 2005, the month after his 21st birthday, and the army did for Harry what it does for a specific kind of person. It gave him structure that was demanding enough to require everything he had, purpose that was concrete and physical and not symbolic, belonging that was earned rather than inherited. He was not, at Sandhurst, a prince in any operationally relevant sense. He was an officer cadet who had to meet the same standards as every other officer cadet, who was shouted at by the same instructors who shouted at everyone else, who succeeded or failed on the basis of what he actually did, rather than what his name was. He responded to it with the relief of someone who has found the right environment after years of the wrong ones. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Blues and Royals in April 2006. He wanted, immediately and without ambiguity, to deploy, to go where his regiment was going, to be what the training had made him, rather than a royal figure attached to a military institution for symbolic purposes. The palace initially blocked the deployment. The security concerns were real. A prince in a combat zone was a target of a specific and significant kind, and the people responsible for Harry's safety understood that reality with a precision that Harry, who was 21 and had just completed officer training, was not fully accounting for in his impatience to go. He called Tiggy during this period. The calls were about what the calls were always about, not the palace politics, not the institutional maneuvering, but the underneath of it, the frustration, the feeling of being managed rather than trusted, the gap between the person the army had made him and the position the institution required him to occupy. Tiggy listened. This is what Tiggy had always done, listened in the specific way of someone who is actually paying attention rather than waiting for their turn to speak, who is receiving what is being given rather than processing it through the filter of their own response. She had been doing this since he was 9 years old. She was doing it now. The distance was different, and the problems were different, and the boy was a man, but the quality of the listening had not changed. Harry deployed to Afghanistan in December 2007. The deployment was secret, a specific agreement between the palace and the press, that the press would not report it, in exchange for exclusive access afterward. He spent 10 weeks in Helmand province, doing the work his regiment was there to do, in conditions that were not ceremonial, and not managed, and not connected in any direct way to the institution he had been born into. He has described those 10 weeks, in his own account of his life, as among the most uncomplicated he had lived, not because they were safe, they were not safe, by any honest assessment of what Helmand in 2008 was, but because they were clear. The complexity of being Harry was reduced, in those weeks, to the complexity of the job. The job was demanding, and the job was real, and the job did not care what his name was. The deployment was leaked by the American website, The Drudge Report, after 10 weeks, and Harry was brought home, and the uncomplicated period ended. He came back to the institutional life that had always been there waiting for him, with the specific difficulty of someone who has briefly inhabited a context in which their particular complications didn't apply and must now return to the context in which they do. William, during these years, was on a more settled trajectory. St. Andrews had produced Catherine and a degree and a social world that was genuinely his own, rather than the institution's provision. The military path he was taking, he was commissioned into the Blues and Royals in December 2006, trained as a helicopter pilot with the RAF and then the Navy, was the path of someone moving through the expected stages with the competence and the composure that had always been his mode. William was suited to the institution in a way Harry was not. This is not a criticism of either of them. It is a description of who they were. Two people formed by the same circumstances differently, one of whom found the institutional structures supportive, and one of whom found them constraining, and both of whom were right about what they found. Tiggy had understood this since they were 10 and 8 years old, at the river, with the fish and the mud and the cold water. She had understood that they required different things, and she had given them what they individually required, rather than what the role generically provided. This understanding, the understanding that these were two different people, rather than two members of a category, was the gift. Not the fishing trips. The trips were the form the gift took. The gift was the seeing. She had seen them. She had seen them when they were children, and she continued to see them, across the phone line, across the years, across the accumulating distance between Glannask and wherever they were. The institution could not replicate this. It had never been able to replicate it. It could provide structures and training and protocol, and the considerable machinery of a constitutional household managing the lives of future monarchs. It could not provide the thing that comes from genuine relationship, from having been there at the beginning and having stayed, from knowing someone before they knew themselves, from having earned the trust, not through institutional position, but through showing up, repeatedly, in the moments when showing up was all there was to offer. That was what Tiggy had given them. It was not replaceable. When she moved to Wales and built her own life, the thing she had given did not move with her in the sense of being present daily, but it had already been placed in them. It was already part of the foundation of who they were. You cannot take back something that has already been given. The institution had tried, in various ways and with various people, to be the thing Tiggy had been. It had not succeeded, because it was not trying to be the thing. It was trying to manage the requirement for the thing, which is different, and which produces a different result. Harry knew the difference. He had felt the difference since he was 9 years old, and he felt it in the gap that opened when the daily presence was gone, and he called Tiggy because the calling was the closest available approximation of what the presence had been. She picked up. She had always picked up. That she was in Wales with her own children, and her own life, and her own reasons to be busy, and that she picked up anyway, was itself the answer to whatever question the calling was asking. William got engaged in October 2010, on a hillside in Kenya, at a wildlife conservancy in the Lewa Downs, where he and Catherine had come for a private holiday with friends. The ring was his mother's, the sapphire and diamond cluster that the world had watched Diana wear for 29 years, and that had sat in a safe since the summer of 1997, waiting for whoever William decided it was waiting for. The engagement announcement was made through the standard palace machinery. The couple gave the standard interview, sat on the standard sofa, answered the standard questions with the particular combination of genuine warmth and managed disclosure that the institution required. Catherine was composed in a way that suggested she had been preparing for composure for a very long time. William was straightforward in the way that he was always straightforward, present, direct, not performing anything beyond what was actually there. Harry stood beside them at the announcement and smiled, and the smile was genuine, and behind it was something more complicated that nobody in that room was going to say out loud. The something more complicated was not, by any honest assessment, resentment. The accounts of the relationship between William and Harry in 2010 and 2011 are consistent on this. Harry was glad for his brother. He loved his brother. The bond between them, formed in the crucible of the same childhood, maintained through the military years and the public years and the years of difficulty that Harry specifically had navigated, was real and not conditional. What the something more complicated was the dawning understanding of what William's engagement meant for Harry's position. Not constitutionally. Harry had understood his constitutional position since childhood, had made his peace with what the birth order meant, had found in the army an identity that had nothing to do with succession. What it meant in a more personal sense, that William was moving into the settled chapter of his life, the chapter that the institution had always been pointing him toward, and that the settled chapter had a shape that Harry's life did not yet have. William was acquiring a center of gravity, Catherine was the center of gravity. Around her, the institutional life that had always been William's would organize itself differently, with a partner at the center of it, with the domestic weight of a genuine shared life, with the specific kind of stability that comes from having decided the main thing and not having to keep deciding it. Harry did not have this. He had the army, which was real and important, and provided the clarity of purpose that civilian life had not provided. He had a circle of friends whose loyalty was genuine and whose company he valued. He had the ongoing public role of a senior royal, the engagements, the causes, the charitable work, the presence at state occasions. He had the phone calls with Tiggy, the calls that continued through the decade as a thread connecting him to the person who had known him before all of it. What he did not have was the center of gravity. He was looking for it. This is the most accurate description of Harry in the years between Afghanistan and Meghan, a person looking for the thing that would organize the rest, that would make the institutional life and the personal life feel like the same life rather than two separate projects running in parallel without quite connecting. The looking produced its own complications. The relationship with Chelsea Davy had been the closest thing to a center for most of the preceding decade. Chelsea was Zimbabwean, the daughter of a safari operator, someone who had grown up in the specific outdoor warmth of southern Africa, in a way that resonated with the specific outdoor warmth Tiggy had introduced Harry to, in the Welsh hills and the Scottish rivers. She was warm, she was funny, she was, by the accounts of people who knew the relationship from the inside, genuinely good for Harry in the way that mattered. Easy with him in the way that very few people managed to be easy with him. Capable of being in the room without the room reorganizing itself around his position. She was also, ultimately, not willing to organize her life around the requirements of his position. This is not a criticism of Chelsea. It is a description of what the position actually required. The managed public existence, the press scrutiny, the negotiation between the private person and the public role that everyone who enters the royal family's orbit must conduct, usually for the rest of their life. Chelsea had watched what the scrutiny involved and had made a clear-eyed decision about whether it was what she wanted her life to contain. It was not. They ended the relationship, definitively, in 2010. The ending had been in process for some time before it became final. The on and off quality of the preceding years had been the relationship working out, in real time, whether the things it contained were sufficient to sustain it. They were not. Chelsea moved back to Zimbabwe and then to South Africa, built a career in law, built a private life that the press could not follow into every corner, built the ordinary life that Harry's position made ordinary life very difficult to have. Harry went to William's wedding as a best man in April 2011 and stood at the altar of Westminster Abbey in his blues and royals uniform and watched his brother marry the woman who was going to be, in a formal constitutional sense, the most important woman in the next chapter of the British monarchy. The wedding was the most watched television event in decades. The crowds were enormous. The route from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Abbey was lined with hundreds of thousands of people who had come, from across the country and from other countries, to see something that the monarchy produces reliably and that nothing else quite replicates. The combination of ancient ceremony and genuine human moment, of history and feeling, of the institution and the people inside it, simultaneously. Tiggy watched from Wales. She was not invited to the wedding, which tells you something about how the institution categorized her relationship with the family, as personal rather than official, as something that had mattered in a private context, that did not have a formal place in the most official occasion the family was producing in a generation. William and Harry's relationship with Tiggy was real. It was not, in the institutional sense, classified as a relationship that warranted a seat in Westminster Abbey. She was in Wales, with her husband and her children, on the 29th of April 2011, watching on television the same way she had watched the coronation footage years earlier. From outside the world, she had spent 4 years inside. Harry got through the wedding, and through the summer that followed, and through the inevitable recalibration that happens when a sibling gets married, and the center of the shared life shifts. He was 27 years old. He had completed 2 tours of Afghanistan, had received the decorations appropriate to his service, had been brought back from the second tour, not on his own schedule, but on the institution's, when the security assessment of his continued presence in a combat zone became untenable. He had a military career that was ongoing, but that had, after 2 deployments, a different quality. The operational deployments were behind him, and what remained was the training role, the instructing, the presence in uniform, that was important and was not the same thing. He was, in the summer of 2012, in Las Vegas. The photographs appeared in August. They had been taken at a hotel suite party. Harry, young, with strangers, in a state of undress, that the photographs made clear, and that the Sun made clearer, by publishing them after the palace had asked the British press not to. The pictures went around the world with the speed that pictures go around the world when they contain a prince, and enough context to write the story the press had been telling about Harry for a decade. The wild one, the difficult one, the one who was going to do this kind of thing, because that was who he was. The story was not who he was. The story was the surface of something that the photographs captured, and that the press reported, and that neither captured nor reported was the underneath. The 27-year-old who had been to war twice, and had come back to a life that did not have the shape that the war years had had, who was searching for something in the way of people who are searching for something without quite knowing what they are looking for. Harry called Tiggy. He has said this in so many words. After the Las Vegas photographs, after the press coverage, after the palace's response, which was to manage the story publicly while managing Harry privately through the standard channels of institutional disappointment, the quiet conversations, the understood expectations, the specific weight of being the person who has made the institution's management of itself more difficult. He called Tiggy, and she picked up, and what passed between them was not in the press, and is not in the public record, and belongs to the category of things that are more important for not being there. What Harry has said, in the general terms he has used when describing those years, is that he was not well. Not in the clinical sense that he would later identify and name. The identification came later, the naming came later, the courage required to say the words publicly came much later. In 2012 he was not yet at the stage of knowing clearly what was wrong. He was at the stage of knowing that something was wrong, that the way things were was not the way things needed to be, that the forward motion the institution required, and that he had been providing, was not carrying him anywhere that felt like where he was supposed to go. He was 28 years old, and he had been providing forward motion since August 31, 1997, which was the morning the requirement began, when the 12-year-old boy in Balmoral had understood, as children in extreme circumstances understand, that survival required organizing around what the situation needed, rather than what he needed. He had been doing it for 15 years. The doing of it had accumulated a cost that Las Vegas was one symptom of, and that the years following were full of other symptoms of. The palace managed the symptoms. The palace was very good at managing symptoms. What it was not able to do, because symptom management and root cause examination are different operations requiring different tools, was address what was underneath. What was underneath was grief. It had been underneath since 1997. It had been underground for 15 years, had become the foundation that everything else was built on, without being acknowledged as what the foundation was, had shaped the person in the way that underground things shape what grows above them, invisibly, completely, without the shape being visible until you know to look for it. Harry began to look for it in 2012, not because he had decided to, but because he had run out of the capacity to not look. He had been going at the rate of something driven by something unnamed for long enough that the engine was running rough, and the roughness had become visible to people around him, and eventually it became visible to Harry himself. He started talking to someone. Not publicly. This was not, in 2012, the stage at which the talking became public. The public stage came later, after William and Catherine had spoken about mental health in the public arena and made it possible for Harry to follow, after the charity they established together, Heads Together, had created a context in which the conversation was happening at an institutional, rather than personal level. In 2012, the talking was private. A therapist. The beginning of the actual work. Tiggy was not a therapist. She was also, in whatever role she occupied in Harry's life by 2012, something that therapy was not. The person who had known him before the grief was underground, who had held him on the morning the grief arrived, who carried the memory of who he had been at 9 and 12 and 15, and who therefore held, for him, a proof of something that the therapeutic process was trying to reconstruct from the inside. She was the external evidence that he had existed as a person before he existed as a person managing things. She was the witness. She had been there. He called her because she was the witness. The calls were not therapy and were not meant to be. They were the specific thing you need from the specific person who was there, the confirmation that the person you were then was real, that the ease you had felt then was not invented, that the river in Wales and the mud and the laughter and the person who held you on the morning of August 31st, 1997, were not things you had constructed from need, but things that had actually happened. They had happened. She confirmed it every time he called, without fanfare, without performing the confirming, by simply being Tiggy, picking up, being the person who had always picked up, the same person she had been when he was 9 years old and she was 30. The world he was moving through in 2012 and 2013 was a world in transition. The Olympic year of 2012 had given Britain a moment of collective enthusiasm that had made the royal family, collectively, feel more popular and more relevant than they had at several points in the preceding decade. The Diamond Jubilee of that same year had produced the specific kind of national expression that jubilees produce, a mass participation in something symbolic, a collective deciding that the symbol mattered, a warmth toward the institution that the institution had been careful to earn through the patient work of being consistently present over 60 years. Harry had been part of both. He had appeared at the Jubilee celebrations and at the Olympics and at the Paralympic Games, and he had done it with the authentic enthusiasm of someone who was genuinely having a good time rather than performing having a good time, which is one of Harry's particular qualities in public appearances: the absence of performance, the directness, the willingness to be actually delighted by things rather than indicating delight. The public liked him for it. The press coverage of Harry in 2012, even after Las Vegas, was not uniformly unkind. There was a strand of British public feeling toward him that was protective rather than critical, that categorized him as someone whose difficulties were understandable given what had happened to him, that felt the coverage of the Las Vegas photographs was excessive in a way that the coverage of something genuinely serious would not be. He was, in public, the relatable one, the one who could be laughed with rather than only admired, the one who made the institution feel human in the way that human is sometimes more attractive than symbolic. And privately, in the therapeutic space he was beginning to inhabit, he was starting to understand what the relatability was connected to, what the warmth and the impulsiveness and the difficulty with institutional constraint were all expressions of, what the foundation of it was, what had been underground since he was 12 years old, and what needed to be brought up if the things built on it were going to be stable. He was working on it. The work was slow and non-linear, and the institution was not organized to support it, because the institution was organized to manage the surface and had limited mechanisms for anything underneath. What supported it, in the non-institutional sense, was the phone, the calls, the person in Wales who picked up.
If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one.
There would be a new chapter arriving soon. Harry was 28 in 2012 and 29 in 2013, and in 2016 he would go to a party in London and meet a woman named Meghan Markle, and the story would enter the phase that everyone alive today has watched in real time: the engagement, the wedding, the baby, the departure, the interviews, the decades of royal family drama reorganized around two people deciding they would not stay inside the walls if the walls were going to cost them what the walls were costing them. But that was still ahead. In 2013, Harry was in the middle of the working out, in the specific difficult territory of someone who has identified that something is wrong and has started addressing it, and is finding that addressing it is harder than the identification was. Tiggy was in Wales. She had a son who was 13 and a daughter who was 11, and a husband who had known her long enough to know what she was and what she had given, and to find this admirable rather than threatening, and a life in the Usk Valley that was the life she had been building since she left the formal role in the early 2000s. She was also, still, the person Harry called. This is not a small thing. The relationships that survive the transition from the context that produced them to a different context, that remain real and warm and genuinely useful after the daily operational justification for them is gone, are the relationships that were real in the first place, rather than real within the context. Tiggy and Harry's relationship had been real in the first place. It had been real when he was 9 and she was 30, and it had been real when he was 12, and she was holding him in a castle in Scotland, and it had been real through Eton and Sandhurst and Afghanistan and Las Vegas and everything in between, and it was still real in 2013, across the miles between wherever Harry was and the Brecon Beacons, on a phone that she picked up because she had always picked up and was not going to stop now. The reasons you show up for someone don't change just because the showing up has changed its form. Tiggy had always shown up. The form had changed from daily presence to occasional phone call, but the showing up was the same showing up, consistent, unconditioned, given without calculation about what it cost or what it earned. Harry knew this. It was one of the things he knew, in the period when a great deal was uncertain. Some things you know because the institution tells you. Some things you know because someone showed you, 15 years ago, at a river in Wales, on a cold morning with the fish not biting, just by being there. Part 6. In 2016, Harry gave a speech. It was not the kind of speech the institution usually produced, not the measured ceremonial language of state occasions, not the careful diplomatic register of someone working through a prepared text with the awareness of every word's weight. It was the other kind. The kind that requires a different form of courage, quieter than the courage of a combat zone, and in some ways harder, because the thing being faced is not external. He spoke about mental health. He spoke, specifically, about his own. He said he had spent years not dealing with the death of his mother. He said he had put his head in the sand for a long time, had kept himself busy, had avoided the thing rather than addressing it. He said that 2 years of therapy had produced a different understanding of what had accumulated and what the accumulation had done to him. He said this in a public forum, with his name attached to it, and the saying of it was an act of institutional courage in the specific sense that the institution he belonged to had never operated by this kind of transparency about the interior lives of its members. The speech came out of Heads Together, the mental health campaign that William, Catherine, and Harry had established together. It was, by the standard of what royal charitable initiatives usually produced, an unusually substantive enterprise, not a ribbon-cutting exercise, not the patronage of an existing cause by a name that would raise its profile, but a genuine effort to shift the national conversation about mental health in a direction the existing conversation was not going. The three of them committed to it with varying degrees of personal disclosure, and Harry's degree was the most extensive, which told you something about the relationship between what each of them was carrying and what they had decided to do with the carrying. William spoke about mental health publicly too, with the specific and considered disclosure of someone who has thought carefully about what to say and why and to what effect. Catherine spoke with warmth and practicality. Harry spoke with the rawness of someone who is telling you the actual thing, not the managed version of the actual thing, and the rawness was visible, and it was also, by any honest assessment, the most useful thing any of them said, because it was the most recognizable. People who were struggling with the things he described recognized the description, not because he was royal, because he was accurate. The question of where this willingness to be accurate had come from, the capacity to say what was actually true about his own experience, rather than the version that served the institution, was a question the palace did not ask, and the press did not ask in any serious way. The assumption was that it was simply Harry's character, the directness that had always characterized him, the refusal to manage himself into palatability that had been generating tabloid stories since he was 16. But character is not the whole explanation. Character is what you have. What you become is character plus the things that happened to you, and the things that happened to Harry included the things that Tiggy had given him in the 4 years when she was the adult on his father's side who made space for him to simply be. What Tiggy had given him, without framing it this way because she was not a person who framed things, was permission. Permission to exist without managing the existence, to feel what he felt without converting the feeling into something more institutionally appropriate, to be the specific and complicated person he was, rather than the version of that person the role required. He had experienced this at 9 and 10 and 11 and 12, at the river and in Wales and at Highgrove on the weekends. that came back easier than they left. He had experienced it as ease, as lightness, as the specific relief of someone in an environment that does not add to their weight. What he had stored from it was not only the warmth. He had stored the knowledge that the ease was possible, that the weight did not have to be total, that there was a way of existing that did not require the continuous management of every surface. That knowledge, carried underground alongside the grief for 15 years, was part of what the therapy brought up. And the bringing up of it was part of what made the heads together speech possible, because you cannot say true things in public until you have said them somewhere first, and the somewhere that Harry had been saying true things, across the phone line to Wales, had been a practice for the public version. He was 31 years old in the summer of 2016, and the mental health work had been going for 4 years, and William was settled and Catherine was settled, and the next chapter of Harry's life had not yet arrived but was approaching, and the approaching of it was something that the people who knew him well could feel without yet being able to identify what the chapter would contain. Meghan Markle arrived in the summer of 2016. A mutual friend arranged the meeting. Harry had been given no particular build-up about her. The account that both of them have given of the first encounter is that they met as strangers who were quickly not strangers, which is an experience that people who have it tend to describe in similar terms, and that is, underneath those terms, not mystical, but specific. Something recognizable in the other person. Something that does not require the full management of self. Meghan was an American actress. She was 34 to Harry's 31. She had a career, a public profile of her own, not the British royal family kind of public profile, the Hollywood kind, the kind that comes from being on a successful television show and from the sustained effort of building a career in a competitive industry over a decade. She was articulate, organized, warm in the specific way of someone whose warmth was also professional and who had learned, through years of the work that professional warmth requires, how to be present with people in ways that felt genuine, because, underneath the skill, they were. Harry called Tiggy. He called her early in the relationship, in the way that he called her when things were significant, not to report, not to check in, but to say the thing to someone who would receive it accurately. He has not made the specific content of this call public, and Tiggy has not made it public, which is consistent with how both of them operate regarding what belongs in the private record. What has been made public, in Harry's own account, is that the people who mattered to him knew about Meghan quickly, and that the knowing was important to him in the way that the knowing of important things is important to people who have someone to tell them to. Tiggy was one of the people who knew. The relationship moved at a pace that was, by the standards of the world Harry moved in, rapid. A summer of getting to know each other, an autumn of increasing seriousness. By the end of 2016 they were together in a way that was past the early stage, and Harry was happy in a way that was visible to the people around him. Not the performed contentment of someone managing the surface, but the actual thing. The ease that comes from having found something you had been looking for, without knowing you were looking for it. What Meghan provided Harry was different in its specifics from what Tiggy had provided, but continuous with it in its essential quality. She was uncomplicated in the way that uncomplicated in Harry's life had always been exceptional. She was genuinely interested in him, in the person, rather than the position, in what he actually thought and felt, rather than in the institutional version of what he was supposed to think and feel. She asked questions and listened to the answers in the way of someone for whom the answers were actually the point. Harry had experienced this before, not in every relationship, not in the complicated years of Las Vegas and the searching and the general difficulty of being Harry in a world that was always receiving him as a symbol rather than a person. He had experienced it early. He had experienced it at a river in Wales, at 9 years old, with a woman who went fishing with him, because she liked fishing and liked him and was not calculating the significance of anything. He knew what he was experiencing when he experienced it. He knew it from before. The relationship went public in the autumn of 2016 when it became impossible to keep it private. The press had found enough threads to pull that the institution understood the story was coming regardless and chose to get ahead of it with a statement that was, by the standards of what palace statements typically contained, unusually direct. It confirmed the relationship. It asked the press to respect Meghan's privacy. It noted, without quite naming the specific coverage that had prompted it, that the coverage had included racist undertones that were not acceptable. The statement was Harry's. He asked for it, pushed for it, made the case for it against the institutional preference for saying less and managing more. The pushing for it tells you something about where Harry was by 2016, about the 4 years of therapeutic work and what they had produced in him, about the heads-together honesty and what it had established as a mode of operating, about the specific person he was becoming, as distinct from the specific person the institution had always required him to be. The institutional preference was to manage. Harry's preference was to say the true thing. The gap between these preferences, which had been visible since Las Vegas and visible before Las Vegas, was going to grow. It was going to grow in ways that would eventually be impossible to manage or ignore or contain within the institutional framework that had always been the framework for managing the gap. But in the autumn of 2016, the growing was only beginning, and what was more visible than the growing was the happiness. Harry was happy. The people around him could see it. Tiggy, in Wales when he called, could hear it. She had watched him look for this. She had watched it from the specific vantage point of someone who had known him before he was looking, who had known the ease he was capable of, and who had understood, through the years of the calls from Afghanistan and from Las Vegas and from the London of the early 2010s, that the ease was available to him, but that the conditions for it were not always present, and that he would need to find the person who could provide them. Meghan was providing them. Tiggy recognized this without needing it explained. She had been recognizing what Harry needed since he was 9 years old, and the recognition had not diminished with distance or with time. She received the news of Meghan the way she received most things that were good for Harry, with the direct and uncomplicated warmth of someone who is simply glad, who finds the gladness sufficient, who does not require the gladness to be more complicated than it is. The institution received the news differently. Not immediately. The immediate response was the managed one, the statement, the request for privacy, the standard choreography of a palace acknowledging a relationship while not yet having determined what to do about it. But underneath the management, the institution was doing what institutions do when something arrives that doesn't fit the existing categories. It was assessing, calculating, determining how this person, from this background, with this profession and this nationality, and these specific characteristics, mapped onto the requirements of the role she would be required to occupy if the relationship became what it appeared to be becoming. The assessment was not straightforward. Meghan was American, which was not unprecedented. Wallis Simpson had been American, which was not a comparison anyone in the palace was making out loud, but that existed as a precedent in the institutional memory. She was an actress, which was its own category of complication in a world that had always maintained a careful distance from the entertainment industry's relationship with visibility and persona. She was biracial, which the press would spend the following years discussing with a candor about racism that was sometimes honest and sometimes itself an expression of the problem it was describing. Harry was aware of the assessment. He was aware of it because he had been inside the institution his entire life and understood how it worked, and because the specific texture of some of the palace conversations he was party to in late 2016 and into 2017 told him, without anyone saying so directly, that the welcome was not unconditional. He called Tiggy from inside this awareness. What he was calling about, in those conversations, was not primarily the institutional complexity. The institutional complexity was something he was navigating with the professional side of his intelligence, the part that had been formed inside the palace and understood its logic. What he was calling about was the underneath of the institutional complexity, the feeling of it, the specific experience of being in a situation where the thing that was making you happiest was also generating a form of resistance from the world you had always lived in. Tiggy had watched this dynamic from close range in 1993, in a different form. She had been the warm presence on Charles's side of a family going through a rupture, and she had felt the resistance that Diana's situation generated toward her, not from the institution, which had found her presence useful, but from the person who understood most clearly what her presence meant. She understood, from her own experience, what it felt like to be in a position where your value to the people who needed you was not matched by the ease of your position in the world around them. She did not offer Harry this comparison directly, She was not a person who offered comparisons or parallels or the kind of reflective insight that sounds therapeutic. She was a person who listened and responded to what was actually there. And what was actually there in Harry's calls in 2016 and 2017 was happiness and complexity existing simultaneously, which is a condition that requires someone on the other end of the phone who can hold both, without requiring the happiness to resolve the complexity or the complexity to diminish the happiness. She held both. She had always been good at holding both. The engagement was announced in November 2017. Harry and Meghan stood in the sunken garden at Kensington Palace, Diana's garden, the garden that the palace had created in Diana's memory, and they held hands and answered questions and were, to anyone watching without the institutional frame around them, simply two people who were evidently and genuinely happy. Tiggy watched from Wales. She was not in the garden, and was not part of the announcement, and was not part of the machinery that managed the day's coverage. She was in the Brecon Beacons, watching on television, being glad in the way she was glad, about things that were good for people she loved. She was glad. Harry was happy. He had been happy for the better part of a year, and the happiness was being formalized into something the institution would have to organize around, and the organizing would be complicated, and the complications would eventually become something that nobody in November 2017 could fully see the shape of yet. But in November 2017, standing in Diana's garden, Harry was happy. Tiggy knew how long the happy had taken to arrive. She had been on the phone through enough of the years before it that she understood the distance it had crossed. She had been there, in the way she had always been there, across all the distance of the years since 1993. Different in its form, but consistent in its nature. She had picked up the phone. He had called. That was the whole thing, really. That was what the whole story had been built out of, in the end, and what it would continue to be built out of, through everything that came next. The phone. The picking up. The rest was just what happened around it. The 19th of May, 2018, was a Saturday, and Windsor Castle in May is one of the better arguments for England that England has to offer. The long walk stretched south from the castle, in the particular green that English grass achieves in late spring. The kind of green that looks implausible if you have grown up anywhere with less rainfall. The crowd that had gathered along the route and around the castle walls was enormous and genuinely festive in the way of people who have decided that today is a day for being festive and have committed to it fully. The bunting, the flags, the picnics on the grass and the children on shoulders, and the strangers talking to each other in the way that English strangers talk to each other at royal occasions, briefly, warmly, with the specific permission that shared ceremony grants for ordinary social barriers to come down. Inside St. George's Chapel, the institution was doing what it does at weddings, producing ceremony of a quality that nothing else in the modern world quite produces, the accumulation of centuries of practice visible in every element, in the choir and the flowers, and the specific quality of light through the stained glass, and the way that ancient stone holds a kind of silence underneath the sound that makes everything said within it feel more permanent. Harry stood at the altar in his blues and royals uniform and watched Meghan walk toward him, and the watching of it was visible on his face in the way that things are visible on Harry's face when he is not performing, completely, without management, with the full force of someone experiencing the thing rather than observing himself experience it. She was extraordinary. This is the word the accounts settle on, consistently, across the different perspectives of people who were there and people who watched. Not in the conventional sense of extraordinary applied to brides, not the dress, though the dress was perfect, not the composure, though the composure was real. Extraordinary in the sense of someone who walked into one of the most watched rooms in the world and was entirely present in it, who did not diminish in the face of the occasion, but expanded to meet it, who seemed to understand that the moment required her to be completely herself, and was completely herself without apparent effort. Bishop Michael Curry gave the sermon. This was not a standard Church of England sermon. Bishop Curry was the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church in America, and he preached in the tradition he came from, with the full force of a tradition that understands the sermon as an event rather than an address, that brings the body into it as well as the voice, that does not ask the congregation to receive quietly, but to participate in what is being offered. He spoke about love. He spoke about fire. He quoted Martin Luther King. He spoke for 14 minutes in a chapel where sermons ran to 5, and the congregation did not fidget, and the watching world did not look away. The institution was not prepared for Bishop Curry. The institution had known he was coming. Meghan had chosen him, and the choice had been approved, and his presence in the chapel was not a surprise. What was a surprise was the specific force of it, the way it transformed the temperature of the ceremony from the managed warmth of an official occasion into something more immediate and less containable. The camera kept finding members of the royal family as the sermon went on, finding their faces doing the thing that faces do when they are simultaneously moved and unsure of what the moving means for the context they are in. Harry's face was doing something different. Harry's face was doing what Harry's face always did when the thing in front of him was genuine. It was open. He was listening with the same completeness that Tiggy had watched him give to the river when he was 9 years old, the same fullness of attention that meant he was not thinking about anything else while the bishop was speaking. Tiggy was in the chapel. She was there. After the wedding preparations and the institutional management and the seating plans that reflected the hierarchy of what was official and what was personal, Tiggy was in St. George's Chapel on the 19th of May 2018, watching Harry marry Meghan. She had been in the hospital in Aberdeen when he was born. She had been in Balmoral when his mother died. She had been at the river when he first understood what ease felt like. She was here now. The ceremony ended, and the couple appeared on the steps of the chapel, and the crowd produced the sound that crowds produce at such moments. Not organized, not directed, but the simple collective release of something that had been building and was now being given permission to emerge. They drove in the open carriage through the streets of Windsor, and the streets held what streets hold at royal weddings. The accumulated desire of people who want something to believe in, and have found, for this afternoon, something. The reception was at Frogmore House, in the gardens of the Windsor estate, in the early summer evening. The accounts that have emerged from it describe dancing, speeches, a band, the specific texture of a celebration among people who are glad for the same reason. Harry danced. He danced in the way of someone who is not thinking about how the dancing looks. The institution woke up the following Monday and continued managing the ongoing business of being the British monarchy in the 21st century, and Harry and Meghan woke up as the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, and the world that had watched the wedding moved on to the next thing, and what remained was the marriage, and what the marriage would encounter. What it encountered, in the months that followed, was something that the wedding's warmth had not fully predicted. The press coverage shifted, not all of it, and not immediately, but with the cumulative effect of water finding its level, gradually, then completely. The tabloid coverage of Meghan in the months after the wedding developed a quality that was, by the standards of tabloid coverage of royal women, not unusual in its form, but was, in its specific application to Meghan, connected to things that went beyond the ordinary appetite for royal drama. There was a strand of it that was about her specifically, her background, her family, her previous life, the gap between what she was and what the institution expected. There was a strand of it that engaged with that gap in terms that were recognizable to anyone paying attention, that used language and framing and the selection of detail in ways that said something about who the coverage thought she was and where she came from. Harry noticed. He had been reading the coverage of his family since he was old enough to read, which had given him a lifetime of experience with the tabloid press and its specific methods. He understood those methods. He had been the subject of them. He understood the difference between coverage that was harsh and coverage that was something else, and the something else was present in a way he found intolerable. He said so. He said so to the people around him, to the people in the institution, to the people whose job was to manage the palace's relationship with the press. He said it in the direct way he said most things, without the diplomatic management of language that the institution preferred for communications of this kind. The institution heard him. The institution also had its own relationship with the press, a long and complicated relationship, built on mutual interest and mutual dependence, on the understanding that the press needed access, and the palace needed coverage, and that both parties benefited from the management of the tension between them. The relationship was not simple, and the people managing it were not naive, and the management was not straightforward. What Harry wanted was not always compatible with what the management required. This was not new. The gap between what Harry wanted and what the institution preferred had been a feature of his public life since he was a teenager. What was new was that the gap now included Meghan, and Meghan was not an institution in training. She was a person who had spent her adult life managing her own public narrative with the professional tools the entertainment industry provided, and the tools the British tabloid press was applying to her were different in kind from anything she had encountered before. The specific coverage that arrived in the autumn of 2018 concerned a letter. Meghan had written a letter to her father, Thomas Markle, in the period of crisis before the wedding, a period that had been, by the accounts of everyone involved, genuinely difficult. Thomas Markle had been photographed in a staged paparazzi session shortly before the wedding, practicing poses for the cameras in arrangements that had been set up and paid for. The photographs had run, the story had run. Thomas Markle had then had a heart attack, real or claimed depending on which account you accepted, and had not attended the wedding, and had then begun giving interviews to the press about his daughter and his exclusion. Meghan's letter, written in the months after the wedding, in an attempt to reach her father and repair what was repairable, appeared in the Mail on Sunday in February 2019. It appeared without her permission and was accompanied by commentary that framed it in terms unflattering to Meghan and sympathetic to Thomas Markle. She sued. The decision to sue was hers. It was also, by the accounts available, not universally supported within the palace. The institutional preference, when the tabloid press produces coverage that the institution considers inaccurate or unfair, is rarely to take legal action. The legal action produces more coverage, extends the story, makes the conflict the story rather than the original offense. The preference is to manage, to absorb, to be seen to be above it. Meghan's preference was to respond to something that was factually wrong and legally actionable with the legal action it warranted. The preference was American in character, the instinct of someone from a culture where the defamatory publication of private correspondence was something you addressed directly, where passivity in the face of injustice was not automatically the correct response. The tension between these preferences, the institutional preference for management and Meghan's preference for direct response, was not only about this specific legal case. It was about something more fundamental, about whose methods would govern the decisions of the Sussex household, about how power within the marriage and within the institution was distributed, about what it meant to be inside the royal family if the inside produced conditions that both Harry and Meghan found untenable. Harry called Tiggy. The calls in this period were different in character from the calls that had preceded them, in the way that calls change when the stakes of the situation have risen. Harry had called her from Afghanistan, and from Las Vegas, and from the years of searching in London, and in all of those calls the difficulty was personal. Something in Harry, something about Harry, something that Harry was working through. The calls in 2018 and 2019 were about something that included the personal, but exceeded it. They were about a situation, about the marriage encountering an institution that was not, in all the ways that mattered, capable of receiving what the marriage contained. He was not looking for Tiggy to solve it. She was not in a position to solve it. She was in Wales, outside the palace walls, outside the institutional framework. What he was looking for was what he had always looked for from her, the person who would receive what was actually true without requiring it to be managed into something more convenient. What was actually true was this: the institution he had been born into was not able to protect his wife in the ways that a person who had given everything to be part of the institution deserved to be protected. The press was producing coverage of her that was, in Harry's assessment and in the assessment of people outside the immediate family who were watching the same coverage, racially inflected in ways that went beyond ordinary tabloid hostility. The palace's mechanisms for responding to this were inadequate. The people within the palace who might have advocated more forcefully for a different approach were operating within their own institutional constraints. He was inside the institution. He was also watching the institution fail, in a specific and personal way, someone he loved. Tiggy had watched something structurally similar once before, had been close to Charles when Charles's marriage was collapsing, when the institution was managing the collapse with the efficiency it brought to institutional management and without the warmth that the actual human situation required. She had been the warmth then for two boys who needed it. She understood, from the inside, what the institution's management looked like when it was applied to situations that were also personal. She did not draw the comparison out loud. It was not the kind of comparison Tiggy made. She listened to what Harry was telling her, and she received it as what it was. The account of a man watching his wife encounter something that was genuinely difficult, and feeling the inadequacy of the available institutional response. She held it. She was good at holding things. Archie Harrison Mountbatten Windsor was born on the 6th of May 2019 at the Portland Hospital in London. He weighed 7 pounds 3 ounces. His parents were present at his birth in the manner of a different generation from the one that had produced Harry's own birth. Together, in the room, the delivery managed as a private medical event rather than an institutional occasion. The announcement was made hours later. The photographs were taken at Windsor Castle the following day, the three of them, Harry and Meghan and Archie, in front of St. George's Hall, with the specific combination of obvious happiness and obvious exhaustion that attends the first days of parenthood, regardless of where you live. Harry's face in those photographs is the face of someone who has arrived somewhere. He had been looking for the center of gravity. He had found it in Meghan, and now the center had expanded to include Archie, and the expansion had produced the specific kind of happiness that is also a form of terror, the happiness of something irreplaceable, existing in a world that is not always careful with irreplaceable things. Tiggy called. The call went the other direction this time. She called him. This is in the record in the way that small details sometimes survive. Someone who knew both of them mentioned it, in the context of describing how Tiggy had responded to Archie's birth. She called Harry. She said what you say when the person you have known since they were 9 years old becomes a father. She said it directly, without performance, in the specific warmth of someone for whom the occasion was genuinely moving. He had been, for 4 years, the person she took fishing. He was now a father. The conversation lasted a while. This is what people who knew about it said, that it lasted longer than the quick congratulation call, that it was the kind of conversation that happens when the occasion connects to a long history, and the history makes the occasion mean more than the occasion alone could contain. Tiggy had been there, at the beginning of so much of what Harry was now looking at in his son's face. She had been there when he was the age Archie was now. She had been the adult who had showed him what ease looked like, and he was now the adult who was going to try to give his son something of what she had given him. The ease, the room to be, the specific gift of someone in your life who is not requiring anything from you while they are with you. He understood, holding Archie, what the gift had been. The understanding arrived with the particular clarity of becoming a parent, the retrospective comprehension of what the people who were there for you actually gave, what it cost them, what it meant that they gave it, rather than not giving it. Harry had known Tiggy was important to him since he was 9 years old. He understood, in a different way, with Archie in his arms, what the importance had been made of. The summer of 2019 was the last summer of the official arrangement. It was not clear that it was the last summer, at the time. People inside and outside the institution understood that things were difficult, that the Sussex household and the institutional framework around it were not in a stable relationship, that the coverage was continuing, that Harry and Meghan were managing something that the institutional tools available to them were not adequately addressing. But the end of the official arrangement, the formal stepping back from senior royal duties, had not yet been announced. It was announced in January 2020. Harry and Meghan posted on Instagram, which was itself a statement about how the relationship with institutional communication had evolved. The statement went to the public directly, through their own channel, rather than through the palace's channels, rather than with the palace's prior knowledge and management. They said they intended to step back as senior royals. They said they intended to be financially independent. They said they intended to continue to support the Queen. They said these things in language that was theirs rather than the institution's. The palace was not pleased. The understatement of that sentence requires acknowledgement. The palace was not pleased in the specific way of an institution that has just had one of its members communicate directly with the public in a way that bypassed the institution's communication apparatus entirely. The response was rapid and involved the emergency summit at Sandringham. The Queen, Charles, William, Harry, together in a room, working out what the stepping back would actually mean in practical terms, what the financial arrangement would be, what the title situation would be, what the continued connection to the institution would look like. Harry, in his account of the Sandringham summit, describes a conversation that was, underneath its surface management, a conversation about belonging, about what the institution was offering and what it was capable of offering, and whether what it was capable of offering was sufficient for the life he and Meghan needed to live. The answer he arrived at, sitting in that room with his grandmother and his father and his brother, was no. He left the room having agreed to terms. The terms were that Harry and Meghan would step back from senior royal duties, would no longer be working royals, would pursue financial independence, and would retain their titles. They would leave. They would go to Canada initially, and then to the United States. They went. Tiggy was in Wales when it happened, watching from the outside of the institution that she had been inside briefly and had left willingly, years ago, and which Harry was now leaving in circumstances that were considerably more complicated than hers had been. Her leaving had been the conclusion of a role that had naturally ended. His leaving was a rupture, not clean, not mutual, not free of the institutional weight that ruptures of this kind carry. He called her from the other side of it. She picked up. The conversation was private and has remained private, which is consistent with every significant conversation between them that this account has traced across the preceding 27 years. What passed between Tiggy and Harry in January 2020, across the Atlantic from wherever Harry was in Canada to Glanusc in Wales, belongs to the category of things that matter more for not being in the public record. What the public record contains is the shape of the story. Harry, who had been looking for the ease since he was 9 years old, who had found it in specific moments and specific people, and who had spent years trying to find the conditions that would make it sustainable, had now made the largest decision of his institutional life in service of the attempt to make it sustainable. He had chosen the ease over the institution. He had chosen Meghan and Archie and the life they were going to build over the life the institution had mapped out for him. Tiggy, who had given him the first experience of what the ease was, would have understood this without needing it explained. She had always understood Harry. That was the whole thing, really. From the river in Wales in 1993 to the phone in whatever room he was in when he called, across the whole distance of 27 years and everything they had contained, she had always understood Harry, and she had always picked up. California is a long way from Balmoral. This is not only a geographical observation, it is a description of two different understandings of what a life should contain, two different relationships to weather and landscape, and the specific quality of light that shapes how you experience the ordinary hours of a day. Balmoral is grey and wet and ancient and demanding, a place that requires something from you in exchange for what it gives. California, specifically the enclave of Montecito where Harry and Meghan settled in the summer of 2020, is warm and private and surrounded by money that has organized itself into the specific form of money that has decided not to be seen working hard. It is beautiful. It is not a place that anybody would describe as home, if home is the word that means where the part of you that is oldest and most itself lives. Harry had not gone to California because it was home. He had gone because it was possible, because the geography of it, the distance from the institution, the private roads, and the security and the specific culture of a community that contained enough famous people that the presence of two more famous people was not a daily event, made it possible to do the thing they had left to do. Build a life that did not require the continuous negotiation of every element with an institution that had its own ideas about how the life should be built. The building began in earnest in the spring of 2020, which was also the spring that the world stopped. COVID arrived in March with the particular efficiency of something that does not care about existing arrangements, and the existing arrangement that it disrupted most completely was the arrangement of ordinary life. The movement, the gathering, the ordinary social texture of days, lived among other people, that most people had never thought to name as precious until it was removed. For Harry and Meghan, who had just reorganized their entire existence, who were in a new country, in a new house, trying to construct a new version of a life, the pandemic's arrival was both complicating and clarifying. Complicating because they were far from the people they were close to, because the phone was now the only instrument available for connection, and the phone has limits, because Archie was an infant, and the infant required everything, and the everything had to be provided in isolation. Clarifying because the isolation removed the immediate noise, the press coverage, the institutional management, the daily production of being public figures in a world that was suddenly not producing daily public anything. Harry and Meghan made a television series. They made a podcast. They signed deals that were of a scale that caused comment in Britain, not because the scale was unusual for their American context, but because the British context, where the notion of senior royals monetizing their access was a category violation of a specific kind, received the scale as evidence of something it found uncomfortable. The commentary was consistent with the commentary that had been running since January 2020, the institution framing the departure as a betrayal, the departure framing the institution as a failure, neither framing available to be tested against the other, because the testing would require a conversation that neither party was ready to have. The conversation happened publicly, instead. On the 7th of March 2021, Harry and Meghan sat with Oprah Winfrey in a garden in California and talked for 2 hours. The interview was broadcast on CBS in America and ITV in Britain, and the viewing figures on both sides of the Atlantic were the viewing figures of something that the audience understands is significant before they have finished watching it. Not because royal interviews were unusual, the royal family had been doing television since the 1969 documentary, but because this interview was doing something the institution had not organized and could not control, which was allowing two people who had been inside the palace to describe what being inside had been like. What they described was specific. Meghan described reaching a point during her pregnancy with Archie at which she had told Harry she could not be inside her own head any longer, that she needed help, that the thoughts she was having were not thoughts she wanted to have. She described this with a directness that was, by the standards of what public figures, and in particular public figures connected to the royal family, had previously said on television about their mental states, extraordinary. She had gone to the institution for help. The institution had told her it was unable to provide it because she was not a full employee. Harry described the institutional failure of that moment with the specific anger of someone who has watched a person he loves ask for help and be told by the system around them that the help is not available. He described a period of his own in which he had not been well, in which the situation around him had produced a state that he recognized, from the years of therapeutic work, as not sustainable. He described feeling trapped, not by the people but by the structure, by the invisible walls of an expectation that had never been stated explicitly and could not therefore be addressed directly. He also described a conversation, or the existence of conversations that he did not fully detail, in which concerns had been expressed, within the palace, about what Archie's skin color would be. The conversation about skin color was the thing that the coverage afterward focused on most immediately, because it was the thing that was most direct and most impossible to ignore. Harry did not name who had expressed the concerns. He confirmed, when pressed, that it had not been the Queen or Prince Philip. The not naming produced its own conversation, about who it might have been, about what the concern had been, about what the concern revealed about the world Meghan had entered, and what that world had been capable of expressing, even privately, about the child she was carrying. The palace statement, issued the day after the broadcast, was 4 sentences long. It said the issues raised were concerning, that some recollections may vary, that they would be addressed privately. The phrase, "recollections may vary," generated more coverage than the rest of the statement combined, because it was the phrase that questioned the accuracy of what Harry and Meghan had said, without specifying what was inaccurate, which is a specific kind of institutional response, not a denial, not an acceptance, but a planting of doubt without the accountability of an actual counterclaim. Harry had done what he had always done when the situation required it. He had said the true thing. The true thing, in this case, was the account of an institution that had failed the person he loved in a specific and documented way, and that had operated, in its private conversations, with assumptions about race that reflected something real about what the institution was, and where it had come from, and what it had never been required to examine. The Heads Together speech of 2016 had been a practice run of sorts, the first time Harry had said something true about his own interior experience in public, the first time he had allowed the audience to see inside the managed surface. The Oprah interview was the larger version. It was not a practice run, it was the decision, made with full awareness of what it would produce, to put into the public record the account of what had actually happened. Tiggy watched the interview in Wales. She had been watching Harry from Wales for 20 years by then, watching from the outside of the institution that she had briefly inhabited, watching through the phone calls and through the news, and through the occasional contact that the distance made occasional rather than regular. She had watched the Heads Together speech. She had watched the engagement announcement. She had watched the wedding in St. George's Chapel from a seat inside the chapel. She had watched the departure and the move to California and the documentary and the podcast and all of it. She watched the Oprah interview in the way of someone who has known the person being interviewed since the person was 9 years old, not as a viewer but as a witness to the longer story, of which the interview was the most recent and most public chapter. What she would have heard in the interview, underneath everything the interview contained, was the thing she had always heard when Harry talked, the direct line between what he experienced and what he said about it. She had known him to have this quality since he was a child. He was not a person who managed the translation between feeling and expression with the institutional fluency that the palace produced in its members. He felt things, and he said them, and the gap between the feeling and the saying was smaller in Harry than in almost anyone else she had ever known in proximity to the institution. This was what the institution had always found difficult about him, and this was what had made him, in the specific circumstances of March 2021, the person whose account of the institution carried a weight that institutional communication could not match, because the account came from someone who could not be accused of performing honesty, who had demonstrated the same honesty at 9, and at 12, and at 28, and at 36, and who was therefore, by the standard of the only evidence available, simply honest. Prince Philip died on the 9th of April 2021, 33 days after the broadcast. He was 99 years old and had been in declining health. The death was not unexpected in the way that the deaths of very old people are not unexpected, known to be coming, prepared for in the institutional sense, not therefore without grief, but without the shock of the kind that Diana's death had been. He had been the longest-serving consort in British history. He had been, in his specific, difficult way, the person who most completely understood what it meant to be the consort of the monarch, to occupy a position that was central and subordinate simultaneously, to give everything to the role, while the role gave you a title and very little else. Harry flew back for the funeral. He came alone. Meghan was pregnant with Lilibet, and her doctors had advised against travelling. He came back to the country he had left 15 months earlier, to the family he had left in conditions that had not been resolved by the leaving, to the institution he had described on American television as having failed his wife in the specific ways he had described. The coverage of his return had the particular quality of coverage that is watching for something. The cameras tracking whether William and Harry would speak, would walk together, would produce the visual of brothers reunited that the narrative required. The funeral was private, 90 people in St. George's Chapel under COVID restrictions, the country watching on television. What the television captured was William and Harry walking side by side after the service, talking, in a moment that was either the beginning of a reconciliation or the performance of one, and the cameras could not tell the difference, and neither could anyone watching. Harry went back to California. The conversation in which William and Harry had walked side by side after the funeral did not resolve what was unresolved. This is documented in Harry's account of the period. The walk was real, the conversation was real, the specific content of it remained private, and what followed the walk was the continuation of the difficulty rather than its conclusion. He wrote the book. The decision to write the book was made in 2021, and the book was published in January 2023, and the book was called Spare, which told you everything you needed to know about Harry's relationship to his own position before you had read a word. Spare, the extra, the one whose existence was structurally defined by not being the primary. The title came from Harry, and it was chosen with the full understanding of what it communicated. The book was ghostwritten by J.R. Moeringer, who had previously written The Tender Bar, his own memoir of growing up without a father and finding father figures in the men around him. The choice of Moeringer was not incidental. Moeringer understood from the inside the specific literature of someone making sense of an absence at the center of their formation, of someone looking back at what was there and what wasn't, and what they had built from both. Harry gave Muringer everything. This is the account both of them have given of the process. Harry talked, and Muringer asked questions, and the talking went deep into territory that Harry had not previously made public, and some of which he had not previously articulated, even to himself. The process was therapeutic in the way that serious memoir writing is therapeutic, which is to say it required the confrontation of things that had been managed rather than understood, and the confrontation produced things that surprised even Harry about what was in there. The book was the most direct account of the institution's interior from someone inside it since The Little Princesses. The comparison is not perfect, the contexts are different, the relationships are different, the stakes are different. But the structural similarity is present. Someone who had been trusted inside the palace walls had written honestly about what was behind them, and the honesty was the violation, and the violation produced a response from the institution that was total. The response was not identical to what had happened to Crawford. The mechanisms available to the institution in 2023 were different from those available in 1950, and Harry's position was different from Crawford's in ways that mattered. He was the son of the king, not a former employee, and the relationship between an institution and its members is different from the relationship between an institution and its staff, even when both relationships are being strained to their limit. But the pattern was recognizable. The institution managed the book as a problem. The coverage of the book was, in Britain specifically, largely hostile, not to what the book said exactly, but to the act of saying it, to the decision to make private things public, to the specific violation of the unspoken contract that the royal family maintained with the people inside its world, which was, what happens inside, stays inside. Harry had decided that contract was not one he had signed. Tiggy read the book. She would not have said what she thought of it to anyone who was going to make what she thought of it public. That is not who Tiggy is, and who Tiggy is had not changed from who she was in 1993. She read it privately, in Wales, and what she made of it was hers. What the book contained that was relevant to their specific history was not the account of the institution, not the descriptions of the family dynamics, not the revelations that the press focused on most energetically. What was relevant, for someone who had known Harry since he was 9, was the account of the years she had known him, the years at Balmoral and Windsor and the river and the mud, written from inside the experience of someone who understood, now, what those years had been made of. He described her with love. This is not a surprise to anyone who has followed the preceding 7 parts of this account. He described her with the specific love of someone who understands that the love has roots going back to before he understood what roots were, who knows that what she gave him in those years was foundational in the way that foundations are, invisible from the surface, bearing everything above them, discovered only when you look for what the structure is built on. She had given him the first version of ease. She had given him the proof that it existed. She had given him, at 9 years old, by the river in Wales, something he had spent the following 27 years trying to recreate in various forms and with various degrees of success. He had found it in Meghan. He had found it in Archie, in Lilibet, in the house in Montecito with the warm California light, and the distance from the institution, and the specific freedom of a life organized around itself, rather than around the requirements of something larger. The something larger was still there. It would always be there. He was still a prince, still the son of the king, still connected to the institution by birth, in a way that no decision could sever. The connection was permanent. What had changed was the terms of it, what he would give the connection, and what the connection could ask. The book said this, in the terms Harry had available for saying it. The terms were direct and sometimes raw, and occasionally imprecise, in the way that memoir is imprecise, when the wound is not fully healed, but they were his. They were the true account of someone who had been looking at their own life honestly for several years, and had decided to put the honesty on the page. Tiggy had known he was capable of the honesty since he was 12 years old. She had not been surprised by any of it. She had just kept picking up the phone. The Netflix documentary came out in December 2022, a month before the book. 6 episodes, released in 2 batches, produced by Harry and Meghan's production company, covering the arc of their relationship from the beginning, through the departure, and into the California years. It was watched by more people in the first week than almost anything else Netflix had produced in Britain. The viewing figures were not a surprise. The royal family generates viewership the way that certain kinds of weather generate attention, not because people have organized themselves to watch, but because the thing is there and they look. What was in the documentary was, structurally, the same thing that was in the Oprah interview and would be in the book. The account from the inside, the dissolution of the managed distance between the official portrait and the private reality, the specific disclosure of someone who had decided that the unspoken contract of royal silence was not one they were bound by. The press response in Britain was largely what the press response had been to the Oprah interview. Outrage at the disclosure. The specific outrage of an institution's defenders when someone inside the institution makes the inside visible. Not outrage at what was disclosed, exactly, but at the act of disclosing, at the violation of the category, rather than the content of the violation. Harry was used to this by now. He had been inside this specific response since 2020 and had developed, through the years of therapeutic work and the years of saying true things in public, a relationship with the response that was not quite indifference, but was no longer the destabilizing thing it had once been. He understood what the outrage was doing and why it was doing it, and what it revealed about the institution it was defending. He called Tiggy. The calls continued through the documentary release, and through the book release, and through the coverage of both. They continued in the way they had always continued, not frequently enough to be a daily mechanism, not so infrequently as to be occasional, regularly. The regular contact of someone who remains present in your life, because the presence has survived every reorganization that the life has undergone, which is the only test of what genuine presence is. What they talked about in these calls has not been made public in detail, and will not be made public in this account, because what they talked about belongs to the private record that Tiggy has always maintained, and that Harry, for all his public honesty, has also maintained regarding specific conversations rather than general experience. The calls are in the record as a fact. Their content is in the record as a privacy. What can be said about the calls in this period is what can be said about the calls across the whole arc of the preceding 29 years, that they were the thread connecting who Harry had been to who Harry was, the thread that had not broken through Afghanistan or Las Vegas, or the departure, or the documentary, or the book, or any of the intervening episodes that had strained most of the other threads in his life to various degrees of tension. Tiggy had not broken. She had not broken in 1993, when Diana's hostility toward her was at its most active. She had not broken in 1997, when the morning of August 31 required everything she had. She had not broken through the quiet years of the phone calls, when the calls were all there was. She had not broken through the departure, and the California relocation, and the Netflix documentary, and the Oprah interview, and the book. All of it, the whole accumulated weight of the public Harry, had not produced in Tiggy any visible recalibration of who she was to him, or what she was willing to give. This is not a small thing. It is, in the accounting of what people actually provide each other across difficult years, among the most significant things available to be provided. The question of whether the institution recognized this was answered by the institution's characteristic method: silence, not hostile silence. The silence of an institution that does not have a mechanism for recognizing what Tiggy had given, because what Tiggy had given was not institutional in its nature, and the institution's recognition apparatus was organized around institutional contributions. She had been given no formal acknowledgement, no honor, no title, no public ceremony of the kind the institution organizes when it wants to say thank you to someone through official channels. The relationship between Tiggy and the boys she had raised had always existed in the personal register rather than the official one, which meant that when the institution distributed its formal gratitude, it distributed it in the official register, and Tiggy was not there. She had not given what she gave in order to receive formal gratitude. She had given it because it needed to be given, and she was capable of giving it, and the giving was its own completeness. But the absence of acknowledgement from the institution tells you something about how the institution classified what she had done, which was as personal, as the private arrangement of a man with his children's care, rather than as a function of the institution, and therefore, as outside the institution's accounting. The institution's accounting is not always the correct accounting. The correct accounting of Tiggy's role in the lives of William and Harry would require the institution to acknowledge that during the most vulnerable years of the heirs' childhoods, the thing that made those years survivable on their father's side was not an institutional provision, but a personal one. A woman who happened to have the right qualities, who happened to be available, who happened to be willing, and who happened to love them with the specific love that the situation required. None of that was inevitable. None of it was guaranteed by the institutional structures around them. It arrived in the form of Tiggy because Tiggy was there and was who she was, and could not be anyone else. What the institution produced in the heirs during this period was protocol and schedule, and the managed public life of children being prepared for a specific future. What Tiggy produced was the knowledge, carried in the body before it is carried in the mind, that ease was possible, that the weight didn't have to be total, that someone could be glad to see you for no institutional reason whatsoever. This knowledge was not in any document. It was not in any program or curriculum or official arrangement. It was in Harry, who had received it at 9 years old, who had carried it through everything that followed, and who had spent the better part of his adult life looking for the conditions that would make it permanent. He had found those conditions in Montecito, with Meghan and Archie and Lilibet, with the warm light and the distance from the institution and the specific freedom of a life organized around itself. He had found them, and he knew where they came from, and the knowing was part of what the book had tried to put into the public record. The institution was not interested in the knowing. The institution was interested in managing the aftermath of the book, which had produced the coverage it had produced, and which had further complicated an already complicated relationship between the palace and its most publicly difficult member. Harry went to the coronation. Charles III was crowned on the 6th of May, 2023, in Westminster Abbey, in a ceremony of the kind that the British state machine has been refining for 1,000 years, and that it produces, when it produces it, with a completeness that nothing else quite matches. Harry came alone. Meghan stayed in California with Archie, who turned 4 that day, his birthday coinciding with his grandfather's coronation, in the way that family calendars sometimes produce coincidences that contain everything you need to know about the difficulty of the situation. Harry flew in. He flew in quietly, without the announcement that his arrival would have generated if it had been managed through the official channels, without the diplomatic preparation that significant royal movements typically required. He landed, attended the ceremony, and left the following day. The departure was as quick as the arrival. He was on a plane back to California before the coverage of his presence at the ceremony had finished generating its full cycle of commentary. The decision to attend was his. It was also, by the accounts available, not an easy decision, not in the sense of requiring courage exactly, but in the sense of requiring the navigation of a situation that contained several contradictions simultaneously. He was the king's son. The king's coronation was an event he wanted to be present for as a son. He was also the person who had written the book and given the interview and made the documentary. And his presence at the coronation was not going to be received as simply the presence of a son at a father's ceremony. It was going to be received as a statement, read as a statement, covered as a statement, regardless of whether he intended it as one. He attended as a son. The coverage received him as a statement. The seating reflected the changed position. He was not on the front row, not in the position that working senior royals occupied, not in the sightline that the cameras tracked throughout the ceremony. He was further back, present, visible if you were looking for him, not the focus. The institution had organized the visual with the institutional precision that the institution brings to visual organization, and the visual communicated, without needing to say it, what the institutional position on Harry currently was. He sat in his seat and watched his father be crowned. The ceremony had the quality that coronation ceremonies have had since the one Crawford watched in 1937, ancient, serious, requiring of the person at its center a combination of genuine faith and genuine endurance, that is, when you watch it closely, genuinely moving, regardless of your views on monarchy. Charles bore it with a dignity that surprised some of the people who had watched him for decades and had not always found dignity to be his predominant quality. He was 74 years old. He had waited for this his entire life, in the way that heirs wait, not with impatience exactly, because impatience has an endpoint it is moving toward, but with the sustained attention of someone who understands that the thing is coming and who has organized their life around the understanding. He was king now. The thing had come. Harry watched him and felt what sons feel when their fathers do something significant, which is a mixture of things that do not resolve into a simple feeling, pride and grief, and the old complicated love that fathers and sons carry for each other across all the complications of the specific relationship they have had. Charles and Harry's relationship had been many things over the decades that this account has traced. It had been warm when Harry was young, and distant when distance was what the institutional life produced, and broken in specific ways by the departure, and the book, and the interview, and it was not repaired by the coronation. But Harry was there. He had come. The coming was its own statement, different from the statement the coverage made of it, the statement of a son who, regardless of everything, was present when presence was the question. He left the following morning. Tiggy watched the coronation from Wales. She had watched it as she had watched the previous generation's coronation, from outside the institution, on a screen, as a citizen rather than a participant. She had been inside the ceremony for Harry's wedding in 2018, had been given a seat in St. George's Chapel because Harry had wanted her there for his wedding, and the institution had accommodated the wanting. For the coronation she was in Wales. She had been at the centre of things briefly. She had done what she was asked to do, and what she was capable of doing, and then she had gone back to the life that had always been hers, the valley, and the river, and the family she had built there, the private life that the appointment with the princes had deferred, and that she had built, with patient thoroughness, once the deferral was over. She watched Harry on the screen, sitting in his allocated seat, watching his father, and she understood without needing it explained what the day contained for him. She had known him too long to need explanation. She understood him from the inside, from the years of the knowing, and the understanding did not require the current events to be translated. She was in Wales. He was in Westminster Abbey. He would call. He always called. The parallel that this account has been circling without quite naming is this. What Tiggy gave the royal family's children, and what the royal family gave back, do not balance. The parallel is with Crawford, who gave 16 years and received silence. It is not a perfect parallel. Tiggy left voluntarily, left when the role had naturally concluded, left for a marriage and a family and a life in Wales that she had wanted, and that she built, and that by all available accounts has been genuinely good. She was not destroyed professionally. She was not exiled socially. She was not reduced to an Aberdeen flat with failing health and no income. The parallel is not in the outcome, it is in the structure. Tiggy gave 4 years of something that the institution needed and could not have produced through its own mechanisms. It needed warmth for 2 boys during the worst years of their childhood, needed someone who could make the institutional weight bearable on their father's side, needed a presence that was consistent and genuine and unconditioned. The institution did not have a department for this. It had protocol and household management and the various professional categories of royal service, and none of those categories was equal to what 2 boys in that situation actually needed. What it needed was a person, a specific person, with specific qualities, who happened to be available and willing. Tiggy was that person. She gave it 4 years of her life, the 4 years between 30 and 34, the years in which a woman who has built a career and has plans for the next stage of the career gives those plans to something else and builds the next stage later. In exchange, she received a salary that was appropriate to her official title of personal assistant, the experience of the role, and the private acknowledgement of the 2 people whose lives she had most directly affected. She did not receive public recognition. She did not receive formal honor. She did not receive the institutional acknowledgement that would have made her contribution part of the official record rather than a footnote in the personal accounts of the people she had served. The institution classified what she had given as personal, as Charles's arrangement for his children's care, and therefore as outside the register of things the institution acknowledged. This classification was not cruel, it was structural. The institution does not have a mechanism for acknowledging the personal. Its acknowledgement apparatus is organized around the official, and the most important things in the lives of the people within it are frequently the least official. What Tiggy gave Harry was not official. It was the most important thing anyone gave him during those years, and it was personal, and the institution has no record of it. The record exists in Harry. It exists in what he has said about her, publicly and privately, across the years of this account. It exists in the fact of the phone calls. the sustained contact that has outlasted the official role by more than 20 years, and that shows no signs of concluding. It exists in what he carried from the river in Wales at 9 years old into every subsequent year of his life. Crawford carried something similar. She carried the memory of 2 children she had loved, and the record she had made of loving them, and the carrying of it was the only thing the institution could not confiscate, because she had sent it out into the world before the confiscation could reach it. Tiggy has not written a book. She has not given a documentary interview. She has not put into the public record, through any of the available mechanisms, her account of what those 4 years were. The privacy she has maintained is total and consistent and freely chosen. Nobody has required Tiggy's silence the way the palace required Crawford's silence. She has simply not spoken, because speaking is not how she understands her relationship to the experience. The experience is hers and Harry's and William's. What is hers is not for public record. This is the position she has held since 1993, and it has not shifted. But her silence is different from Crawford's silence in a fundamental way. Crawford's silence was imposed by an institution that had decided her speaking was a violation. Tiggy's silence is chosen by a person who has decided her privacy is a value. Crawford's silence was the institution's method of managing a threat. Tiggy's silence is her own understanding of what the years with the boys actually were and who they belonged to. They belonged to the boys, not to the press, not to the palace, not to the documentary record or the biographical literature or the public understanding of how 2 princes became the men they became. The years belonged to William and Harry, and what happened in them was for William and Harry, and what Tiggy knew of them she kept, because keeping was the right thing to do with something that wasn't hers to give away. This is the essential difference between Tiggy and Crawford, and it tells you something about both of them. Crawford gave away what was not hers to give, not out of malice, not out of greed, but out of financial necessity in a situation the institution had produced. Tiggy did not give away what was not hers, and the not giving was not sacrifice or self-denial, but simply the correct understanding of what the experience had contained. She had been there for them. What she had seen and done and given was hers in the sense of being her experience, but the heart of it, what William and Harry had been in those years, what they had needed and what she had provided, that was theirs. She kept it for them. The institution gave her nothing official in return. The institution's accounting did not include what she had given, because what she had given was personal, and the institution does not account for the personal. This is a structural failure of the institution's accounting, not a moral failure of the people within it. And the distinction matters without changing the outcome. The outcome is that Tiggy Legge-Bourke gave the royal family's heirs the most important non-parental relationship of their childhood, sustained it through one of the most difficult periods those children encountered, extended it across 3 decades of phone calls and occasional presence, and received in return no formal acknowledgement that this had happened. The acknowledgement she received was Harry calling, William's continued warmth, the seat in St. George's Chapel in May 2018, the private knowledge, held between 3 people rather than published in any document, that what she had given had mattered in the specific way that foundational things matter, invisibly, completely, in everything built on top of it. It was not nothing. It was also not the accounting that her contribution warranted. What remains, at the end of this account, is the question of what the story is actually about. It is not only about Tiggy. It is about the institution she served, and what the institution does with the people who give it the things it cannot produce for itself. It is about the specific way that the royal family, not through cruelty, not through deliberate calculation, but through the structural blindness of an institution organized around its own perpetuation, receives what it needs from the individuals within its orbit, and accounts for what it has received imperfectly at best. Crawford gave 16 years and received silence. Tiggy gave 4 years and received privacy, hers, chosen. The correct response to an experience she understood as belonging to the people she had served. The outcomes are different. The structure is the same. The institution needed something it could not produce itself. An individual provided it. The institution received it, used it, and moved forward, without the kind of reckoning that would require it to examine what it had taken and what it had given in return. The reckoning is not coming. The institution does not reckon in this mode. It manages, perpetuates, continues. The individuals within its orbit give what they give and receive what they receive, and the institution processes both without changing the structure that produced the imbalance. What changes is not the institution. What changes is the individuals. Crawford changed. The silence changed her in ways that were visible and documented, and that this account has traced across 12 parts. She was diminished. The world she had given herself to was removed from her, and she spent the remaining 38 years of her life in the diminishment, bewildered by the gap between what she had given and what she had received. Tiggy did not change in that way. She left before the leaving could be imposed. She built the life she had deferred. She maintained the connections that mattered, the phone calls, the occasional presence, the seat in the chapel at the wedding, without requiring the institution to acknowledge that the connections were worth maintaining. She required nothing from the institution because she had understood, before the institution needed to demonstrate it, that the institution was not organized around what she needed. This is wisdom of a specific kind, not the wisdom of someone who has been burned and learned from the burning, the wisdom of someone who understood from the beginning where the warmth was and where it wasn't, and organized themselves accordingly. The warmth was in the boys, not in the institution. In the specific, irreducible, unchosen warmth of two children who needed her and received what she gave and carried it forward into everything they became. That warmth was real, and it was hers, and it was theirs, and no institutional silence could reach it. Harry is 39 years old in 2024. He is in Montecito with Meghan and Archie and Lilibet. He has the life he left to find, the center of gravity, the ease, the specific freedom of someone who has stopped negotiating with the institution about the terms of his existence. The negotiation is over. The terms he accepted were his terms. He still calls Tiggy. She is in Wales, in the valley, with Charles Pettifer and their children, who are in their early 20s now, and making their own lives in the way that children of good parents make their lives, not identically to their parents, not in rejection of them, but in the ordinary divergence of people who were given enough foundation to build from. She picks up when Harry calls. This has not changed, and there is no indication it will change. William is 41. He is the Prince of Wales, the heir, the man who will one day be king in the way that his grandmother was queen, with the constitutional seriousness and the long preparation and the organized self that the institution produces when everything goes according to the institutional design. He has Catherine and 3 children and a public life of considerable complexity and a private life that is, by all available indication, genuinely settled. He carries what Tiggy gave him in the way that settled people carry the foundational things, so integrated into the structure that the structure itself would have to be dismantled to find the specific thing that is holding it up. He does not call Tiggy with the frequency Harry does. He does not need to, which is its own testament to what she gave him. She gave him enough, in those 4 years, that the giving became part of who he is, rather than something he needs to reach back for. The institution produced, between 1993 and 1997, a situation it had not designed and had not anticipated. It needed warmth for 2 boys in a specific kind of crisis, and warmth arrived in the form of a woman from the Brecon Beacons who liked fishing and was glad to be with them and had no institutional agenda whatsoever. The warmth was received, the boys were shaped by it. The institution moved on without accounting for it. This is not a story with a lesson that the institution will learn. Institutions do not learn from individual cases unless the individual cases force a structural examination that the institution has reason to avoid. The royal family has every reason to avoid the structural examination that Crawford's story and Tiggy's story together would require, because the examination would produce a conclusion the institution has never been willing to reach, that what it takes from the people most essential to it is not accounted for by what it gives back. The conclusion is available to anyone who looks. Crawford looked, from Aberdeen, with the flat accuracy of someone who has had 38 years to examine the gap between what she gave and what she received. She did not find a satisfying resolution because there was no satisfying resolution to find. The gap was real and remained real, and she died with it unresolved. Tiggy has not looked in the same way because she is not in the same situation. She is not diminished, not exiled, not bewildered by a gap she cannot close. She built her life outside the institution, before the institution could impose its accounting on her, and the life she built is the life she has, and it is good, but the institution's accounting is still imperfect. The thing Tiggy gave is still unacknowledged in the official record. The boys she raised into men are still carrying what she gave them, without the carrying being part of any institutional account of how they became who they are. The account is here instead, in 12 parts. In the specific and irrefutable fact of a woman who went fishing with 2 boys because they needed someone to go fishing with them, and who picked up the phone for 30 years because picking up was the right thing to do, and who gave the royal family something it could not produce for itself, and did not know how to recognize when it received it. The royal family received it anyway. It is in William, in the settled quality of someone who was given enough ease at the right time to build from. It is in Harry, in the directness and the willingness to say the true thing and the specific knowledge, carried since he was 9 years old, that ease was possible and worth finding and worth the cost of finding it. It is in both of them, permanent, born forward into everything they are and everything they do, the invisible foundation that Tiggy built in 4 years at the river and on the hills, and in the ordinary warmth of someone who showed up, because showing up was simply who she was. The institution did not acknowledge it. The boys knew. That was always the only acknowledgement that mattered. That was always enough. There is a photograph that does not exist in any official archive. It has not been published in any newspaper or featured in any documentary. It was not taken by a royal photographer or released through the palace press office. It exists only in the way that the most important photographs exist, in the memory of the people who were there, in the specific detail that someone who was present might recall if asked directly, in the private record that Tiggy has always maintained rather than the public one. The photograph that doesn't exist is this: a woman in her early 30s, at a river in Wales, with 2 boys. The elder boy is 10 or 11, serious-faced, concentrating on the water with the focused attention he brings to everything. The younger boy is 4 or 5 years younger, louder, probably already laughing at something, probably already performing for whoever is watching. The woman is between them, or near them, or slightly downstream, close enough to be present, far enough to let them be in the experience rather than in her management of it. It is not a significant photograph. Nothing significant is happening. There are no cameras because there is nothing worth photographing in the official sense. No ceremony, no public occasion, no moment the institution needs to record. Just a woman and 2 boys at a river on a Welsh morning, doing the thing you do at a river, which is wait for fish and talk about nothing, and exist in the particular peace of being somewhere with someone who is glad to be there. This is the photograph that captures the whole story. Not the wedding in St. George's Chapel, not the Oprah interview, not the coronation, or the departure, or the documentary, or the book. The river, the morning, the 2 boys who did not yet know what they would become, and the woman who did not care what they would become, who cared only about what they were, which was children who needed someone and who had found her. Tiggy Legge-Bourke's own children grew up watching this. Charlie Pettifer was born in 2000. His sister, also named Tiggy, in 2002. They grew up in the Brecon Beacons, in the valley, in the house at Glanwsk that their mother had grown up adjacent to, and that she came back to after the royal years were over. They grew up with a mother who was warm in the way that genuine warmth is, not performed, not cultivated, simply present, the baseline of how she was with everyone she was with. They also grew up knowing, in the way that children of significant parents know things without being told them directly, that their mother had done something important before they arrived, that there had been years before their years, when she had been somewhere else giving something to someone else. The princes were part of the family's story in the background sense, not intrusive, not a constant topic, but present in the way that significant history is present in a family, available to be understood when the children were old enough to understand it. Charlie and Tiggy Jr. grew up understanding that their mother was someone who showed up. This is the inheritance she gave them, not the royal connection, not the proximity to greatness, not the story of what she had done. The understanding that showing up was the fundamental thing, that the showing up was the offer, and the offer was the love, and the love did not require anything in return to be real. This is what good parents give their children. The inheritance is not money or status or connection. The inheritance is a model of how to be, the specific, visible example of someone living a life according to values that can be witnessed and absorbed and carried forward. Tiggy's values, demonstrated over 30 years of picking up the phone and being at the river and holding a 12-year-old on the worst morning of his life, were absorbed by her children alongside the values of their father and the valley and the specific outdoor life of the Brecon Beacons. They are adults now. They are living their lives in the way that children of genuinely good parents live their lives, with the foundation intact, with the model available, building from what they were given rather than away from it. What they were given was Tiggy. The institution will not give William's children a Tiggy. This is not a prediction. It is a structural observation. George, Charlotte, and Louis are growing up inside the institution in the specific way that the heir's children grow up inside it, with enormous care, with considerable professional management, with all the resources that the most resourced family in Britain can bring to the raising of children. They are growing up with two parents who are, by every available indication, genuinely present and genuinely devoted. They are growing up with the specific advantage of parents who have thought carefully about what their own childhoods lacked and who are attempting to provide something different. They are not growing up in the same circumstances William and Harry grew up in. The marriage of their parents is not collapsing. The institution around them is not producing the specific crisis that produced the specific need that produced Tiggy. The need for what Tiggy provided was a product of specific circumstances that are not being replicated. But the institution will face other circumstances. It always faces other circumstances. The specific circumstances change. The structural situation, the institution's need for the human warmth it cannot generate through its own mechanisms, the individual's provision of that warmth, the institution's failure to account for what it has received, this does not change. It reproduces itself in different forms across generations, with different people and different crises and different outcomes. Somewhere in the orbit of the royal family, in 2024, there is probably someone doing something like what Tiggy did, not in the same role, not in response to the same crisis, not with the same specific qualities that made Tiggy Tiggy, but doing something that the institution needs and cannot provide for itself, doing it because they are the person available and willing and capable, and doing it without a contract that specifies what they will receive when the doing is finished. The institution will receive what they give. The institution will not account for it. The pattern continues. What breaks the pattern is not the institution changing. Institutions do not change their fundamental patterns through individual cases, even visible ones, even ones that produce books and documentaries and 12-part scripts. What breaks the pattern, in individual cases, is the specific person within the orbit deciding what they will give and on what terms. Tiggy decided, without perhaps fully articulating the decision. She gave what she gave from who she was, rather than from calculation. But the result of giving from who she was, in the context of an institution that would not have protected her if the giving had cost her what it cost Crawford, was that she gave within the limits of what she could afford to give. She gave 4 years. She loved those boys with everything the 4 years contained. She then went to Wales and built her own life, and picked up the phone when it rang. She did not give her whole professional identity. She did not give the decades that Crawford gave. She gave the years available to her, and she protected the rest, not because she was calculating, but because she was healthy, because she had the kind of self-knowledge that Crawford, formed differently, in a different era, with different expectations, had not had at 22 when she agreed to the first month. Crawford agreed to the first month and stayed for 16 years. Tiggy agreed to the appointment and stayed for 4 years and then went home. The difference is not one of loyalty. Crawford was as loyal as Tiggy, and more so in the duration of it. The difference is that Tiggy had a home to go to, a man who was waiting, a valley that was hers, a life that had not been organized entirely around the institution, and the self-awareness to go back to it when the institutional role concluded. She went back. The going back was possible because she had not given the thing Crawford had given, which was the whole self, organized entirely around the institution, with no reserve and no alternative, and nothing kept back. Crawford had kept nothing back. Tiggy had kept herself back. Not in the sense of holding out or being less than fully present in the role, but in the sense of remaining, underneath the role, someone whose existence was not contingent on the role. She was Tiggy before the princes, and she was Tiggy during the princes, and she was Tiggy after the princes. The continuity of self is not a small achievement in the context of the royal household, which tends to absorb the people who enter it with enough force that the absorption is total by the time the person understands it is happening. Crawford was absorbed. Tiggy was not. She remained herself. She took the calls and gave the fishing trips, and held Harry on the morning of August 31, and attended the wedding in the chapel, and picked up the phone across 30 years of Harry needing to call, and through all of it, she remained the person from Glanursk who liked the river, and liked the boys, and would be in Wales when she was done. This is the wisdom that the institution cannot teach, and cannot require, and cannot produce through any of its mechanisms. It arrives in individuals, or it doesn't arrive. It arrived in Tiggy, and the institution was fortunate that it did, because the alternative, two boys in a specific crisis, with no one on their father's side who was capable of providing what Tiggy provided, would have produced different men, different in ways that might have mattered for the institution more than the institution's failure to acknowledge what Tiggy gave has mattered. The institution benefited from Tiggy's presence in those boys' lives in ways that continue to be visible, in William's stability, in Harry's directness, in the specific qualities each of them brings to the public roles they occupy, such as those roles currently are. The institution received the benefit without accounting for the source. This is, finally, the only thing left to say about the royal family's relationship with the people who give it what it cannot provide for itself. It receives. It does not account. It moves forward with what it has received, incorporated into the structure, bearing the weight above it, without the weight knowing what is holding it up. What is holding it up, in this specific case, is a woman in the Brecon Beacons who went fishing with two boys and picked up the phone for 30 years and never once asked for anything in return. She is still there. The phone still rings. She still picks up.
Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.